Welcome to Wickless Night. There is something different about a night with no light at all, no candle burning, no lamp in the corner, just darkness, silence, and the feeling that something may be closer than it should be. Tonight's stories come from people who lived through moments they still cannot explain. A sound in an empty room, a stranger at the door, a shadow that moved when no one else was there. Before we step into the dark, leave a comment and tell me where you are listening from tonight. And if you enjoy slow, unsettling, true horror stories, subscribe to Wickless Night. Get comfortable. The lights are already gone.
When I was in college, I went through at least one or two periods where I regularly saw what I can only describe as shadow people and shadow animals. I do not mean vague shapes that I noticed once or twice. For stretches of time, they became part of my normal surroundings. I would walk into class and see dark, human-shaped figures standing near the corners of the room. Sometimes I would pass through hallways and catch what looked like another student moving nearby, except the person seemed to be made almost entirely of shadow. Outside my dorm, I would occasionally see animal-shaped figures waiting near the entrance or moving at the edge of my vision. They were dark enough that I could rarely make out details. No clear faces, no recognizable clothing, usually just the general outline of a person or animal. At first, it terrified me. I have bipolar disorder, so naturally one of my first fears was that something was seriously changing with my mental health. I knew enough about myself to pay attention to whether I was becoming manic or otherwise unstable. As far as I could tell, I was not. I did not feel unusually energetic. I was not going days without sleep while feeling fine. I was not becoming grandiose or reckless. I was functioning, going to class, talking to friends, keeping up with ordinary life. The shadow figures seemed strangely separate from everything else. That was what confused me. If I had been obviously unwell in other ways, maybe I would have understood them as part of the same problem. Instead, I felt mostly like myself. I also did not think the experiences matched anything obvious about the medication I was taking at the time. That was only my own impression, though. I was not in a position to determine medically what was or was not causing them. All I knew was that the timing did not make sense to me. So my mind went in two directions. One possibility was frightening in a very personal way. Maybe I was losing my grip on reality. The other possibility was frightening in a completely different way. Maybe the figures were actually there. Maybe I was seeing spirits. At first, I went back and forth between those two ideas. Neither was comforting. If the shadows were coming from my own perception, I worried about what that meant for me. If they were external, then why was I suddenly seeing them? Why were there so many? And why did the campus seem full of them? The college itself probably influenced how I thought about it. There were places on campus that felt emotionally heavy. That is difficult to explain without making it sound supernatural. I do not mean the air physically changed or that I had evidence of anything paranormal. It was more of an atmosphere. Stress, people struggling, students exhausted, relationships falling apart, academic pressure, mental health problems, loneliness, all the things that can exist underneath the surface of college life even while everyone looks normal walking between classes. At the time, I started thinking there was some kind of aura of despair around the campus. And in my mind, that despair attracted the shadow figures. That explanation made emotional sense to me. The darker the place felt, the more natural it seemed that dark things would gather there. But looking back, I know there are other ways to understand that connection. College itself can be exhausting. Sleep schedules become terrible. People stay up studying, wake early for class, spend hours staring at screens, drink too much caffeine, skip meals, live under fluorescent lights, walk through dim hallways late at night. All of those things can affect attention and perception. A stressed, tired brain is more likely to misinterpret movement, shadows, reflections, and objects in peripheral vision. So what I experienced as a campus attracting shadow people may have been something very different. Maybe the environment was affecting me, just not supernaturally. The first few times I saw the figures, I would stop and look directly toward them. Usually, the shape would disappear or become something ordinary. A dark corner, a chair, a coat, someone farther away. Sometimes there did not seem to be anything there at all. That should have reassured me. Instead, early on, it made things creepier. Seeing something disappear when you look directly at it does not feel like a normal mistake in the moment. It feels like something moved because it realized you noticed it. That interpretation is almost automatic when you are already afraid. You catch a dark person-shaped figure at the edge of your vision. You turn. Nothing, the frightening thought is, it hid. The more ordinary explanation is, peripheral vision gave me incomplete information, and my brain briefly interpreted it as a person. Peripheral vision is very good at detecting motion. It is much worse at fine detail. The brain has to make fast guesses about what is happening near the edge of sight. A vertical shadow becomes a person. A backpack becomes an animal. Movement from another student reflects off glass and appears in the wrong place. You look directly, and the detailed part of your vision corrects the mistake. That is probably how at least some of my experiences happened. But at the time, I did not think about visual processing. I thought about the shadows. There were human ones and animal ones. The human figures were often easiest to notice in classrooms. I would be sitting there listening to a lecture and become aware of what looked like another student near the corner. Sometimes they seemed to be sitting, other times standing. They rarely did anything dramatic. They did not rush me. They did not scream. They did not crawl across the ceiling. Most of the time, they simply occupied space. That almost made them stranger. They behaved like ordinary people, while not looking like ordinary people. The animal figures appeared outside more often. I might be approaching the dorm and see a dark shape near the entrance. Something dog-sized, maybe smaller. Again, if I looked more carefully, the details were never stable. Sometimes the figures seemed to vanish. Sometimes it became part of the environment. At first, every sighting made me tense. I would think, there's another one. Then I would start watching the area more closely. That probably made me notice even more ambiguous shapes. Attention can feed a pattern. If someone tells you to watch for red cars, suddenly you notice red cars everywhere. They were always there. Your attention changed. I suspect something similar happened with the shadows. Once the idea of shadow figures became important to me, every dark movement became worth remembering. Ordinary visual mistakes that I would once have forgotten in 2 seconds now became part of a growing collection. That does not mean the experiences were fake. I really saw what looked like figures. The question is, what produced the perception? There is an important difference between saying, I saw a shadow person, and saying, there was definitely an independent shadow person physically standing there. The first describes my experience. The second makes a claim about the outside world that I cannot prove. Over time, something unexpected happened. I got used to them. That surprised me more than almost anything. At first, I had been frightened that I was either becoming seriously unwell or somehow surrounded by spirits. Eventually, the figures became almost boring. There are only so many times you can see a shadow in a hallway before your nervous system stops treating every appearance like an emergency. I still noticed them, but the fear reduced. Sometimes I even found them oddly familiar. I began treating some of the shadow classmates almost like actual classmates. If I passed one in a hallway, I might say hello. I realize how strange that sounds, but by that stage, the experience was not threatening. I was functioning normally. I knew other people were not reacting to the figures. I was not trying to convince everyone that ghosts were invading the campus. They were simply part of what I was seeing. So sometimes I acknowledged them, almost jokingly. Like, okay, there you are again. Hi, then I kept walking. That casual response probably helped reduce the fear. When something no longer controls your behavior, it becomes less powerful. I stopped changing routes to avoid them. Stopped wondering whether every figure was going to hurt me. Nothing ever did. One of the stranger parts was that I sometimes seemed to know when the shadows were going to return. There would be periods when I did not see them much. Then suddenly I would develop this feeling of being watched, not by one person, by many. It felt like hidden eyes were everywhere. Once that feeling appeared, I would think, here we go again. And before long, I would start noticing shadow people or animals. At the time, I interpreted the feeling as almost a warning, like I could sense their presence before actually seeing them. That contributed to the supernatural interpretation. But there is a grounded explanation for that, too. The feeling of being watched may have been the first part of the same perceptual or anxiety state. I may have become more vigilant before consciously noticing any figures. Once my attention shifted into threat detection mode, ambiguous shadows were more likely to become people. So rather than, the spirits arrived, and I sensed them. The sequence could have been, my brain became more hyper-aware of the environment, I felt watched, and then ordinary ambiguous shapes began registering as figures again. Both sequences feel identical from inside the experience. Only the interpretation changes. Eventually, I told my psychiatrist. I think part of me expected a dramatic response. Maybe she would immediately change my medication. Maybe she would become concerned that I was entering some severe episode. Instead, she was fairly calm. I was otherwise stable. The experiences were not stopping me from going to class. I was not harming myself or anyone else because of them. I was not reorganizing my entire life around the belief that these figures were controlling me. They were not telling me to do things, and by then they were not particularly distressing. So she did not react as though it were an emergency. That calm response actually helped. If a professional who knew my history could hear the story without panicking, then maybe I did not need to panic either. The word hallucinations could be used for what I was experiencing, but even that word felt more frightening to me then than it does now. People often hear hallucination and immediately imagine someone completely detached from reality. But perception can produce unusual experiences for many reasons, and the surrounding context matters. Sleep, stress, medication, mental health conditions, neurological issues, substances, visual effects. Even healthy people can occasionally see or hear things that are not present in the way they appear. One unusual perception does not automatically explain someone's entire mental state. My psychiatrist already knew that. I was the one still learning it. So eventually I stopped worrying about the shadow people. Then, something even stranger happened. They disappeared, not in one dramatic moment. I did not wake up one morning and realize every shadow had vanished. The periods simply became less frequent. Then I left the campus, and after leaving, I stopped seeing them. That fact has always interested me. At the time, it seemed like evidence for my idea about the campus. The shadow people belonged there. The place had attracted them. I moved away. They stayed. That is a very satisfying supernatural explanation. But it also fits ordinary explanations extremely well. Change the environment. Change the sleep schedule. Change stress. Change lighting. Change routines. Change how much time you spend in dim classrooms and hallways. Your perception changes, too. Maybe there was something about that particular phase of college life that made the experiences more likely. Once I left, the conditions disappeared. So did the figures. The fact that they did not follow me actually makes me less worried about them now. Whatever caused them seems strongly connected with that time and place. I later found out that a friend of mine had also seen shadow people. That was unsettling. Their experiences sounded similar in some ways, but were much less friendly. They did not have the casual relationship with them that I eventually developed. For my friend, the figures were frightening. The sad part was that people did not take their reports seriously because they had schizophrenia. That always bothered me. A person's diagnosis can affect how an experience should be interpreted clinically, but it should not mean nobody listens to them. Even if something is a hallucination, the person experiencing it is still experiencing something real, in the sense that the fear, distress, and perception are real to them. Dismissing someone because of a diagnosis does not help. My psychiatrist had shown me a much better response. She listened. She considered whether I was otherwise stable. She cared whether the experiences were interfering with life. She did not need to agree that the shadows were spirits in order to take me seriously. That distinction meant a lot. My friend's experience also made me wonder whether the campus environment contributed somehow. If two people independently saw similar shadow forms, maybe there was some shared visual feature. Lighting, architecture, long dim hallways, trees casting moving shadows, reflective glass, students moving in and out of view, old buildings with high contrast between bright and dark spaces. Those conditions can repeatedly produce person-shaped illusions. If one person is already prone to unusual visual experiences, the same environment could affect them more strongly. That is one explanation. Another possibility is that we talked about shadow people at some point before I learned about their experiences and influenced one another. I do not remember the exact sequence clearly enough to rule that out. Humans share ideas. Once you have a name for an ambiguous experience, you start recognizing things that fit that name. Shadow people is a powerful label because it describes something many people have experienced in different ways. A dark human shape at the edge of vision, a figure during sleep paralysis, a coat mistaken for a person, a moving shadow in a hallway. Different causes can produce remarkably similar descriptions. That does not necessarily mean everyone is seeing the same external beings. It may mean human vision and human fear make similar mistakes. I have also seen a black dog. For some reason, people seem more willing to believe that one. Maybe because a black dog feels more culturally familiar. There are old stories about mysterious black dogs. There are also, obviously, real black dogs. So people can choose whichever explanation feels comfortable. A shadow person sounds like a psychiatric symptom. A black dog sounds like folklore. I have always found that difference interesting. People's willingness to believe an experience often depends less on the evidence and more on what category the story fits into. If I say I saw a dark human figure nobody else saw, someone may immediately think hallucination. If I say I saw a huge black dog in a strange place, the same person might happily tell me about ghost dogs. Neither reaction actually investigates what happened. They are just different cultural stories. I try to be more careful now. I know my own psychiatric history. That is relevant. It does not mean every strange thing I ever perceive is meaningless. But it does mean I should take unusual changes in perception seriously enough to mention them to the people involved in my care. I did that. My psychiatrist evaluated the broader situation. She was not especially concerned at the time because I was otherwise doing well and the experiences were not disrupting my life. That does not mean the same advice applies to every person. If the figures had started threatening me, telling me to hurt myself, preventing me from sleeping, making me afraid to leave my room, or appearing alongside major changes in mood or behavior, that would have been very different. Context matters. In my case, they became almost like strange background characters. There is something almost funny about remembering myself walking past a shadow classmate and saying hi. It sounds like a scene from a supernatural television show. But there was no dramatic response. No ghost turning toward me with glowing eyes. I said hello. Sometimes I felt like there was an acknowledgement. Sometimes not. Then I went to class. Life continued. That ordinary quality is part of why I stopped being afraid. Nothing escalated. No shadow attacked me. No animal chased me. No figure followed me home after I left college. They existed only in those periods of perception. Then they were gone. I think the sense of despair I associated with the campus may also say more about how I felt there than about the physical place. College can carry strange emotional contrasts. Thousands of young people are surrounded by others constantly, yet many feel isolated. Everyone is expected to be building a future while privately worrying they are failing. People party loudly while someone in the next room is having the worst night of their life. A campus can look energetic and still feel heavy. Maybe I gave that heaviness a visual form. Shadow students in corners. Dark animals outside dorms. Hidden eyes watching. That interpretation does not require me to have consciously invented them. The mind can express stress in ways that feel external. Or maybe that theory is too psychological, and the actual cause was something simpler, like sleep deprivation and lighting. I cannot know now. I also cannot completely rule out medication having some role simply because I did not think it did at the time. Medication effects and interactions are complicated. That is exactly why I told my psychiatrist rather than relying only on my own guess. I was not qualified to determine the cause. She had a much better view of my treatment and overall stability. The fact that she did not panic reassured me, but I still think telling her was the right choice. Keeping unusual perceptions secret because you are afraid of being judged can create a much worse problem. You start interpreting everything alone. Maybe spirits. Maybe insanity. Maybe something threatening. Fear fills in whatever information is missing. Talking to someone gives you another perspective. That was valuable for me. I also think people sometimes assume that if you know something may be a hallucination, it stops looking real. That was not my experience. Knowing the shadows might not be physically there did not prevent me from seeing them. Perception happens before explanation. You look toward a corner. There is a person. Then another part of your mind says, probably not actually a person. Those two thoughts can coexist. That is why I could eventually say hello without becoming deeply invested in whether they were real. The experience happened. I did not have to decide the metaphysics every time. Maybe that attitude was healthy. I stopped fighting the perception, stopped feeding it fear, and eventually it faded on its own. The feeling of being watched was harder. There is something primitive about that sensation. You can tell yourself no one is there, but your body still becomes alert. Shoulders tense. You start checking doorways, looking behind you. scanning corners. That behavior itself gives the brain more opportunities to find ambiguous shapes. Again, it creates a loop. Feeling watched leads to searching. Searching leads to noticing shadows. Shadows confirm being watched. Then the sensation strengthens. Once I stop treating every shadow as evidence, that loop may have weakened. There is also a basic visual explanation for some of the classroom figures. Classrooms often have terrible lighting. Projectors create dark corners. Windows reflect students. Computer screens cast moving light. Someone passes in the hallway and their silhouette briefly appears through glass. Your eyes are focused on a professor or notes, so everything outside the center of vision is processed poorly. A backpack on a chair becomes a hunched person. A jacket hanging near a door becomes someone standing there. If you are already expecting shadow people, those mistakes become incredibly convincing. Dorm entrances have similar problems. Outdoor lights, trees, bushes, trash bags, bicycles, people passing behind you. All can create animal-like shapes. The fact that the figures often appeared in corners or peripheral locations rather than standing clearly in the middle of a brightly lit room makes these explanations stronger. That is how I think about it now. But I do not try to erase the strangeness of what it felt like then. There were moments when I really did look across a room and think another student was standing there. Moments when a dark animal-shaped thing seemed to wait outside my dorm. Moments when I felt surrounded by hidden observers before anything appeared. Those experiences were vivid. They were part of my life for a while. I can acknowledge that without saying they were proven spirits. The friend with schizophrenia reinforced that lesson for me. People deserve to have experiences heard without others immediately deciding what they mean. A diagnosis does not make someone dishonest. At the same time, unusual perceptions should not automatically be treated as supernatural evidence simply because more than one person reports something similar. Both extremes can fail the person. Listen first. Consider context. Take distress seriously. Stay open to ordinary explanations. That approach feels much more respectful. I am glad I told my psychiatrist. I am also glad the shadows did not become more threatening. If they had, I think I would remember college very differently. Instead, the story became strange rather than terrifying. At the beginning, I thought I might be losing my mind or being stalked by spirits. By the end, I was occasionally greeting shadow classmates in the hallway. That is a ridiculous progression when I say it out loud, but it is true to how the experience changed. Fear became familiarity. Then familiarity became indifference. Then, after I left campus, the whole thing disappeared. I have not seen the same shadow people since. That ending is probably the part I find most interesting. If they were independent beings attracted to me, why did they stay behind? If they belonged to the campus, why were they there? If they were produced by my perception, what changed after I left? Sleep, stress, medication, lighting, routine, mood, age? There are too many variables to know. The supernatural explanation gives a simple answer. The campus had something dark around it, and the shadows lived there. Simple answers are appealing. But simple does not mean proven. The natural explanations are less dramatic and probably more realistic. A particular combination of mental health, environment, attention, sleep, and visual conditions may have created periods where I interpreted shadows as people and animals. Then the combination changed. So did the experience. I can live with not knowing exactly which factor mattered most. What I no longer do is assume that seeing something strange means I have only two choices. I am completely insane. Or ghosts are real. There is a huge amount of space between those conclusions. Human perception is complicated. Mental health is complicated. Environment matters. Stress matters. And sometimes unusual things happen for a while without defining the rest of your life. That is what happened to me. I went to college. For a time, I saw shadow people. Some stood in classrooms. Some appeared in hallways. Dark animal shapes sometimes seemed to wait outside my dorm. Before the periods returned, I could sometimes feel that strange sense of many unseen eyes watching me. At first, I was frightened. Then, I became accustomed to it. I told my psychiatrist. She listened, looked at the larger picture, and did not treat me like I was falling apart. Eventually, the shadows faded. I left campus. They did not come with me. And even now, when I think about those years, the image that comes back is not some violent ghost encounter. It is something quieter. Walking down a college hallway surrounded by ordinary students, fluorescent lights, classroom doors, backpacks, and conversations. Then noticing one more student standing near the edge of everything. Too dark, no clear face, almost entirely shadow. At the beginning, I would have frozen. By the end, I would sometimes just look in its direction, say hello, and keep walking. Maybe there was never anyone there. Maybe my brain was turning darkness into familiar shapes. That is the explanation I find easiest to live with now. But whatever was happening, it belonged so completely to that campus and that period of my life that when I finally left, it was almost as if I had crossed some invisible boundary. The dorm disappeared behind me. The classrooms became memories. And the shadow people, whatever they had really been, stayed there too. About 3 years ago, when I was around 10 years old, I had an experience while walking to a friend's house that I still think about. It was around 9 at night. A few of my friends had gotten together at one of their houses and wanted me to come over, so I decided to walk there. By then, it was already very dark outside. The walk was not especially long, and I knew the neighborhood. I had probably walked those same streets plenty of times during the day without thinking twice about them. But nighttime changes familiar places. Houses that look normal during the day become dark shapes. Trees blend into the background. Streetlights leave large spaces of darkness between them. Something sitting beside a driveway can look like a person until you get close enough to recognize it. At 10 years old, I probably did not think much about any of that. I was just going to see my friends. I remember getting fairly close to the house. I only had a short distance left. Then I turned a corner. There was someone standing in front of me, maybe 3 meters away, close enough that I did not have time to slowly figure out what I was seeing. My first impression was that it was a man, a very tall man. His body looked completely black, not like he was simply wearing a black shirt and dark trousers. The entire shape below his head seemed dark enough that I could not make out any real detail. His head was the opposite. It looked white, extremely pale compared with everything underneath it. The contrast was what frightened me. White head, black body, tall figure, standing only a few meters away from me on a dark street. I did not stay there trying to understand it. I turned around and ran. There was no brave investigation, no asking the man who he was, no walking closer to see whether the white part was actually a hood, hat, or reflected light. I was 10 years old and terrified. Running home felt like the only reasonable option. I remember moving as fast as I could. I did not want to look behind me because I was afraid I would see the figure following. At the same time, not knowing whether it was following me made everything worse. Then, while I was running, I felt something touch me. It felt cold, more than a brush of wind. In my memory, it felt like something actually grabbed me. That scared me enough to turn around. There was nobody there. No tall man, no person reaching toward me, nothing obvious behind me at all. I kept going. Eventually, I made it home. That should have been the end of the story. One frightening encounter in the dark when I was 10. Maybe I had seen an actual person. Maybe the lighting made him look stranger than he really was. Maybe the cold sensation had been wind, clothing pulling against my skin while I ran, or my own frightened body reacting to the situation. There were plenty of possibilities. But afterward, I started noticing other things. That is the part that has bothered me more than the original encounter. I would sometimes see what looked like people who should not have been there. One was a woman. She looked completely white. Not simply pale-skinned. The whole impression was white. Another time, I saw what looked like a child in my kitchen. Again, completely white. There have been other things, too. Sometimes they are more like figures at the edge of my vision. I turn toward them and there is nothing there. Or I see something just long enough for my brain to register a person before it disappears. That is why I have wondered whether I should tell someone. For a long time, part of me connected everything back to the man I saw that night. It felt as though something changed after that encounter. Before it, I did not remember regularly seeing strange figures. Afterward, I did. That creates a very easy story in my head. I saw something strange. It touched me. Then, strange things started appearing. If you already believe in ghosts or spirits, the conclusion almost writes itself. Something followed me home. But that conclusion is not the only possibility. And the more I think about the original night, the more ordinary explanations become possible. The tall man, for example, may really have been a man. 3 meters sounds close, but at night that is still enough distance for lighting to distort someone badly. Maybe he was wearing black clothing. That would explain why I could not distinguish his body against the darkness. If a street light, porch light, passing car, or other light source caught his head while leaving the rest of him in shadow, his face could look almost unnaturally white. Maybe he was bald, maybe wearing a pale hat. Maybe he had a hood or mask. Maybe I did not even see a face clearly. At 10 years old, I may have registered a pale shape above a dark body and remembered it as a white head. Fear simplifies images. You do not stop to inventory details. You see enough to decide whether something feels safe. Then you react. It is also possible that what I thought was a person was not a person at all. A sign, a tree trunk, a post, a dark coat hanging somewhere, something near a driveway, a pale object positioned above a darker one. At night, the brain is constantly trying to turn incomplete shapes into familiar things. Human figures are one of the patterns we recognize fastest. That is useful because noticing another person quickly can protect us. But it also means we sometimes see people in shadows where no person exists. The fact that I immediately ran meant I never checked. The figure remained exactly as it appeared during the first frightened second. That gives the memory no chance to correct itself. If I had looked for 5 more seconds, maybe I would have seen a man walking normally. Maybe the white head would have become a plastic bag or road sign. Maybe there really was a stranger standing there. I simply do not know. The cold grabbing sensation is similar. At the time, it felt physical enough that I turned around. But running creates all kinds of strange sensations. Clothes pull against the skin. A backpack strap moves. Cold air hits sweat. A branch can catch fabric. Muscles tighten suddenly. When you are already terrified and convinced something might be chasing you, the brain can interpret an unexpected sensation in the most threatening way available. Something touched me. Something grabbed me. The fact that I turned and saw nobody makes an ordinary explanation more likely than an invisible person following me. But emotionally, that was not how it felt. It felt like whatever I had seen had reached me. That idea probably stayed in my mind afterward. And that may be important when thinking about the later figures. Once you become afraid that something is following you, you start watching for it. Not deliberately all the time. But your attention changes. A shadow in the kitchen becomes more noticeable. Movement at the edge of your vision makes you turn faster. A hanging towel briefly becomes a person. A reflection in a window looks like a face. Normally, the brain corrects these mistakes so quickly that you barely remember them. But if you are already expecting something unusual, the mistake becomes important. You remember it. Then, the next one feels like part of a pattern. Peripheral vision is especially strange. The edges of our vision are good at detecting movement, but much worse at fine detail. That is why so many people describe seeing person-shaped shadows from the corner of their eye. Your brain gets a rough signal. Something moved. Something about human height. Maybe a face like light patch. Then, you turn. Now the central, more detailed part of your vision takes over. Nothing there. That can feel like something disappeared. But sometimes there was never a complete person-shaped image in the first place. The brain filled in the missing details before you looked directly. The white woman and white child are more difficult for me to dismiss emotionally because they felt specific. A woman is not just random movement. A child in a kitchen feels like a recognizable figure. But even specific images can come from ordinary perception. Lighting can create silhouettes. Reflections can layer one part of a room over another. Windows become mirrors at night. White clothing hanging on a chair can look like a body. A towel can look like a small person. An open doorway can produce a head and shoulders shape. And sometimes the brain can produce a brief image during periods of tiredness or while moving between sleeping and waking. That does not automatically mean anything is seriously wrong. But repeated experiences are still worth talking about rather than carrying alone. That is the part I wish I had understood earlier. When something scares you, keeping it secret can make it larger. You have nobody checking your interpretation. Nobody asking simple questions. Was the kitchen dark? Were you tired? Did the figure disappear when you looked directly at it? Does it happen mostly at night? Does it happen when you have not slept enough? Do you ever hear anything with the figures? How long do they last? Without talking to someone, all those experiences can turn into one frightening explanation. The man caused it. The figures are spirits. Something attached itself to me. Maybe, but there are many other possibilities, and some are much more ordinary. I think the fact that I was only 10 during the first event matters too. 3 years is a long time when you are young. A memory from age 10 can feel incredibly clear at 13 while still having changed. The tall man may have become taller. The body, darker. The head whiter. The distance, shorter. The cold touch more hand-like. That does not mean I made the story up. Memory is not a recording. Every time we remember something, we reconstruct it. The emotional meaning tends to remain stronger than exact visual measurements. What I really remember is someone or something frightening was directly ahead. It had a pale head and dark body. I ran. Something cold touched or grabbed me. I looked back. Nobody there. That is already enough for the memory to stay. It does not need perfect details. The later experiences may also have changed because I started connecting them together. Maybe before that night, I occasionally mistook shadows for people too. Most children do. But I forgot those moments because they did not mean anything. After the encounter, every strange figure had a context. Now it mattered. Now I remembered. That can make it feel like the experiences suddenly started when really the interpretation changed. There is also the possibility that the first event made me more anxious about walking around alone or being in dark rooms. Fear increases attention. When you are calm, you ignore countless vague shapes around you. When you are scared, you inspect them. That increases the number of things that look strange. It creates a loop. See something frightening. Become more watchful. Notice more ambiguous things. Become more frightened. Notice even more. That loop can continue without anything supernatural happening. I do not say that to dismiss what I experienced. The fear is real regardless of the cause. If you see what looks like a person standing in your kitchen and then it is gone, being told you probably just saw something wrong does not immediately remove the feeling. Your body already reacted. Your memory already stored it. But understanding that perception can make convincing mistakes gives another explanation besides spirits. That is useful. The part of the original story I still find unsettling is how close the first figure seemed. If it really was only 3 meters away, I would expect to see more detail. That could support the idea that I was looking at a strangely dressed person. Maybe someone in black with a pale face. A person standing silently near a road at 9 at night is not impossible. Maybe he was waiting for somebody. Maybe he was walking and stopped when he saw me. Maybe he was as confused by my reaction as I was frightened by him. Imagine being an ordinary tall man wearing dark clothes. A 10-year-old comes around a corner, looks at you, suddenly turns and sprints away. From your perspective, that would be bizarre. You might not even know why. That version of the story is much less frightening. It may also be the correct one. I never saw the man chase me. I never saw him appear at my house. I did not turn around during the run and see him behind me. The only connection between him and the cold sensation is the connection my frightened mind made. That is important. 2 strange things happened close together. I assumed one caused the other. Maybe they were unrelated. I saw a man. I ran. Cold air or clothing touched me. I interpreted it as his hand. The event becomes supernatural only when those pieces are connected. Still, the later figures are something I would not completely ignore. Not because I think they prove anything paranormal. Because if I were still seeing people or figures that other people did not seem to see, and it was happening repeatedly or frightening me, I would want an adult I trusted to know. That could be a parent, another relative, a school counselor, a doctor, a therapist. Someone calm who is not going to immediately tell me I am crazy and is also not going to immediately tell me ghosts are following me. Those are both extreme reactions. What would help is someone who can listen carefully and ask what the experiences are actually like. There is a big difference between occasionally seeing a person's shaped shadow in peripheral vision and frequently seeing detailed people standing in front of you. There is a difference between experiences that happen only when extremely tired and ones that happen throughout the day. There is a difference between something that vanishes when you look directly at it and something that stays. Those details matter, and they are easier to understand when you are not trying to solve everything alone. Telling a therapist would not mean admitting that I am crazy. That is not how I would think about it. It would simply mean I keep seeing things that scare me, and I want help understanding what is happening. That is a reasonable thing to say, especially because the experiences have continued for years. If there is a simple explanation involving stress, sleep, vision, or something else, it would be better to know. And if the experiences are affecting how safe I feel at home or making it difficult to sleep, That is even more reason not to keep them secret. The original encounter itself could still remain unexplained. Maybe nobody will ever know who the tall figure was. That is okay. Not every childhood event gets a perfect answer. What matters more is what is happening now. The man from 3 years ago is a memory. The figures I continue to notice are current experiences. Those deserve to be treated separately. That is something I did not do at first. I built one continuous story. Tall man, cold hand, white woman, white child, peripheral figures, all connected. But maybe they are not. Maybe the first event was a frightening stranger. The cold feeling was an ordinary physical sensation. The later figures are visual mistakes made more noticeable because the first event scared me. Or maybe being tired or stressed plays a role. There are enough possibilities that I do not think jumping straight to a spirit attached itself to me is justified. That explanation might feel like it connects everything, but feeling complete is not the same as being proven. What I do know is that the experience at 10 changed the way I looked at darkness. Before that, a street corner was just a street corner. Afterward, I knew what it felt like to turn one and suddenly see something that did not fit. That kind of memory can stay in your body. Even years later, you approach another dark corner, and part of you prepares for the same thing. Maybe that is why movement at the edge of my vision still gets my attention so quickly. My brain learned, pay attention. You missed something once. Do not miss it again. That is a very normal survival response. It can also become exhausting. I sometimes think about the little details of that first figure and wonder whether I could reconstruct what it really was. Was the head actually white? Or did a streetlight shine directly onto the person's face? Was the body completely black? Or were dark clothes simply blending into the road behind him? How tall was he really? When you are 10, almost every adult man looks huge. Someone who was 6 feet tall might become very tall in memory. Was he standing still? Maybe he was walking slowly. Did he look at me? I cannot remember. Those missing details tell me the memory is not complete enough to prove anything extraordinary. But the feeling of seeing him remains complete. That is often how fear memories work. Facts become uncertain. Emotion stays sharp. The cold grab is the same. I could not tell you exactly where on my body I felt it now with complete confidence. Maybe arm, maybe shoulder, maybe clothing. What I remember is the sudden cold contact and the immediate thought that something had caught me. I turned. Nothing that moment was probably the reason I associated the later figures with the encounter. If I had only seen the strange man and gotten home normally, I might have forgotten him. The sensation made it feel like the event continued after I ran, like distance had not protected me. That is much harder for a child to dismiss. Then, when other figures appeared later, the story felt confirmed. Something really had followed. But again, that is interpretation. I never saw a continuous chain between those events. No figure walked from the street into my house. No physical evidence appeared. No other person saw the same white woman or child with me, as far as I know. The connection exists mainly in my memory. That is another reason talking to someone could help. Not because a therapist can tell me exactly what stood on the street 3 years ago. They cannot. But they could help separate the frightening memory from what I am experiencing now. And if the figures become more frequent, clearer, more frightening, or start affecting normal life, it is better for a trusted adult and a healthcare professional to know rather than waiting and hoping it disappears. I would especially not keep it secret, simply because I was afraid people might think I was lying. Something does not have to be supernatural for it to matter. Even if every figure has an ordinary explanation, I am still the person experiencing the fear. That deserves attention. I think that is what I would tell my 10-year-old self, too. After reaching home that night, tell someone. Do not sit alone trying to decide whether a ghost touched you. Explain exactly what happened. A tall person was near the corner. He looked strange in the dark. I ran. Something cold touched me. Maybe an adult could have walked back with me safely in daylight. Maybe there was an obvious object at the corner. Maybe a neighbor knew who the man was. The mystery might have ended immediately. Instead, the event stayed mostly inside my head, and unanswered things tend to grow. I still cannot say what I saw that night. Maybe it really was an unusually tall man dressed completely in black. Maybe the pale head was some combination of skin and streetlight. Maybe it was a person wearing something over his face. Maybe it was an object that looked human for just long enough to scare me. I cannot know now. But whatever it was, it made enough of an impression that I turned around and ran without hesitation. And the cold sensation on the way home made the fear much harder to shake. The later white figures are different. I know now that seeing something briefly does not automatically mean it exists physically in the room. Vision is complicated. Attention is complicated. Fear is complicated. That gives me more possibilities than I had at 10. It also gives me a reason to talk about it, rather than immediately deciding what the figures are. If there is one thing about the whole experience that still creeps me out, it is not even the woman or the child. It is the beginning. That corner. Because I can remember how ordinary everything felt a few seconds earlier. I was simply walking to a friend's house. The house was close. My friends were waiting. I was probably thinking about what we were going to do once I got there. Then I turned. 3 meters ahead was a tall shape with a pale head and a body that seemed completely black. I did not know who it was. I did not understand what I was looking at. I only knew that every instinct in me said to leave, so I ran home. And somewhere during that run, I felt something cold close around me strongly enough that I turned around expecting to see the figure right behind me. There was nothing there. Maybe that was where the real fear started. Not when I saw the man. When I looked back and saw nobody. Because after that, whenever I caught something white standing where no person should be, or some human shape moving at the edge of my vision, part of me remembered that first night and wondered whether I had really escaped anything at all. I do not know if that interpretation is true. I would rather not assume it is. But if I were still seeing those figures now, I would tell someone I trust and ask for help understanding them. I would not wait for another one to appear before deciding the experience is worth talking about. Maybe 3 years ago, I was out walking my dog one winter evening when I saw something in the sky that I am still completely convinced was real. It was around 7 at night. Because it was winter, it was already fully dark outside. I was doing something completely ordinary. I was not out looking for strange lights. I was not thinking about UFOs, ghosts, or anything unusual. I was just walking the dog through the neighborhood like I had probably done dozens of times before. I do not remember the exact temperature, but I remember the kind of winter darkness where everything above the houses looks especially clear and empty. Streetlights only illuminate the ground around them. Beyond that, the sky feels enormous. I was walking along when I noticed a bright light very high above me. At first, it was barely inside my peripheral vision. Something moved, something bright enough to immediately make me look up. When I turned my head, I saw what looked like a meteor, or maybe a meteorite. Although technically I know now that if it was still in the sky, meteor would probably be the better word. Whatever the correct term, it looked like something entering the atmosphere. And it was bright, really bright. Not like a normal star, not like an airplane light. Not one of those tiny shooting stars that appear for half a second and disappear before you can even point them out. This thing lasted. That was what shocked me. I watched it travel through the sky for what felt like 4 or 5 seconds. That does not sound very long when you say it out loud, but for something you expect to vanish almost instantly, 5 seconds is a surprisingly long time. I had enough time to notice it. Turn toward it. Understand that it was moving. Watch its path. Start thinking about what it might be. And then become genuinely scared. It seemed to cross roughly a quarter of the visible sky before it finally faded. Again, that is an estimate based on memory. I did not have any way to measure the angle. I was standing outside with a dog, not conducting an observation. But it covered a large enough part of the sky that I could clearly track it. It did not just flash in one spot. It traveled. The whole time I was watching it, I became increasingly convinced that it was going extremely deep into the atmosphere. I had seen shooting stars before. Most of those were quick. A little streak. Gone. This was different. The brightness and duration made it feel much closer, much larger. And unfortunately, there was something else already sitting in my mind at the time. Not long before this, there had been that major meteor event in Russia. The one where an object entered the atmosphere and created a huge shockwave. Videos had been everywhere. People had recorded this enormous streak of light across the sky. Windows were damaged. There were all those dashcam recordings showing the sky suddenly becoming incredibly bright. So when I looked up and saw this object, that was immediately where my mind went. Russia, meteor impact. This is happening again. For those few seconds, I honestly thought I might be watching the beginning of another major impact. I remember staring at it and waiting for something else to happen. Would there be a flash? Would I hear an explosion? Was it going to hit somewhere nearby? Would there be a shockwave? Should I run? It is strange how quickly the mind can move when you are scared. The object itself was probably visible for only a handful of seconds, but during that time, I was already imagining what could happen if it survived the atmosphere. My dog, as far as I remember, did not react. That may be another clue that whatever I saw was very high up and silent from where I stood. I do not remember hearing anything. No boom, no crack, no rumbling, just the visual. Bright light moving through the darkness. Then, instead of becoming brighter or reaching the ground, it began to fade. The streak lost intensity. The object seemed to fizzle out. Then, it was gone. The sky returned to normal. That was it. No impact. No explosion. No shockwave. No sirens. Nothing. I stood there for a moment, still looking at the place where it had disappeared. I think I was partly relieved and partly amazed. I had just seen something I had never seen that clearly before. At least, I thought I had. And because it had lasted several seconds, I felt certain it was more significant than an ordinary shooting star. I finished walking the dog and went home. As soon as I got inside, I told my parents. I expected them to be interested. Maybe they would turn on the news. Maybe other people had seen it. Maybe somebody would already be talking about it online. Instead, they acted like I'd imagined the whole thing. Or made it up. I tried explaining what I had seen. It was bright. It lasted several seconds. It crossed a large section of the sky. It looked like a meteor burning through the atmosphere. They did not seem convinced. I think the lack of any immediate news report made them even more skeptical. If a large meteor had really crossed the sky, surely somebody else would have seen it. Surely it would be on television. That was the logic. And when nothing appeared on the news, the story started sounding less believable to them. But I knew I had seen something. I was not standing outside trying to invent an experience. There would have been no reason to. I had simply looked up because something bright entered the edge of my vision. I watched it move. I watched it disappear. That was a real observation. The argument was about what the object actually was, not whether I had looked at an empty sky and randomly imagined a moving light. The next day, I told one or two friends at school. Their reaction was basically the same. That look people give when they are trying to be polite but clearly do not believe you. Yeah, okay, sure, it was frustrating. I did not have a photograph, no video, no news article, nobody standing beside me who could say, I saw it too. So all I had was my story, and apparently that was not enough. After that, I mostly stopped telling people. I did not want another eye roll. There is something strangely embarrassing about describing an unusual experience when nobody believes you. You start feeling like you are trying to convince people of something impossible, even when the event itself is actually very ordinary in astronomical terms. Meteors happen. People see them. Bright ones happen too. Yet because nobody around me had witnessed this particular one, the reaction made me feel as if I were claiming I had seen an alien spacecraft. I had not. I saw a bright object moving through the atmosphere. That is all. Looking back now, I think what I probably saw was a particularly bright meteor, sometimes called a fireball. That would explain almost everything. Most meteors people casually notice are tiny. A grain of material enters the atmosphere at enormous speed, heats up, produces a short streak of light, and disappears. You might see it for less than a second. But some are much brighter and last longer. A larger object can produce a visible trail across a much greater portion of the sky before burning up or fragmenting. If that is what I saw, then 4 or 5 seconds is not impossible at all. What felt like something going deep into the atmosphere may simply have been a long atmospheric path viewed from my position. That is one of the biggest things I understand differently now. When you look at the night sky, you have almost no depth information. A light can look close because it is bright, but brightness does not tell you distance directly. A meteor dozens of kilometers above the ground can look terrifyingly immediate. There are no nearby objects beside it for comparison. No buildings at the same height. No trees. Nothing. You are watching a bright point against darkness and trying to understand a three-dimensional event from a flat visual path. That is difficult. So when I thought, that thing is going really deep, I may not actually have been seeing its altitude change in a way I could measure. I was seeing a long, bright trajectory. My mind converted that into closeness. The recent Russian meteor probably made that interpretation even stronger. That event had shown me that meteors were not always tiny, harmless streaks. Sometimes they could be large enough to cause damage. That knowledge was fresh. So the moment I saw something brighter and longer lasting than the usual shooting star, my brain went directly to the worst example I knew. Here we go again. Part 2. That fear probably made the object feel even more dramatic. But fear does not mean the observation was false. It only affects interpretation. I still saw the light. I just may have overestimated what it meant. The duration is another thing I have thought about. I remember 4 or 5 seconds. Could it have been 3? Maybe. Could fear have stretched it slightly? Absolutely. When you are intensely focused on something, time feels different. A 3-second event can feel surprisingly long. But even if my estimate is off, the object lasted long enough for me to follow it consciously. That separates it from the very brief streaks I normally associated with meteors. The quarter of the sky estimate could also be wrong. The visible sky does not have obvious measurement marks. When I say a quarter, I mean it traveled a clearly significant distance from my perspective. Enough that I had to visually follow it. Not that I somehow measured exactly 90 degrees or anything like that. Memory tends to turn impressions into numbers later. About 4 or 5 seconds. About a quarter of the sky. Those are useful descriptions, but not exact measurements. I think that distinction matters because people sometimes hear an estimate and attack the estimate instead of the experience. If it was really 3 seconds, that does not mean I imagined it. If it crossed 1/6 of the visible sky instead of 1/4, same thing. The core remains. Bright meteor-like object. Long visible path. Winter night. Fades before reaching the horizon. No impact. Another thing that confused me at the time was the complete lack of news. I thought anything that bright had to be reported. Now I understand that this is not necessarily true. The Earth is huge. The sky is huge. A meteor can look spectacular from one local area and still have no major consequence. If it burns up high enough, there may be nothing to report except eyewitness accounts. And if nobody happens to record it clearly, it may never become a news story. There are countless astronomical events that never appear on television. The news is not a complete record of everything visible in the sky. I did not understand that at the time. To me, the reasoning was big-looking meteor equals news. No news equals maybe nobody believes me. But the object did not hit anything. There was no explosion that I heard. No property damage. No injuries. Nothing that would force local media to pay attention. It may have been noticed by plenty of people who simply went home and continued their evenings. Maybe someone else stood in another neighborhood thinking, that was incredible. Then, never told anyone. That is completely possible. There could even have been people who saw only the final second and thought it was an ordinary shooting star. My viewing angle may have been unusually good. I happened to notice it early because it entered the edge of my vision. If I had looked up 2 seconds later, I might have seen only a quick flash and forgotten it. Timing matters. The fact that I was walking the dog helped too. I was already outside. Most people were probably inside at 7 on a winter night. Curtains closed, watching television, eating dinner, working, using computers. Even if a spectacular meteor crossed overhead, only the small percentage of people who happened to be outside and looking in roughly the right direction would see it. That realization makes my parents' reaction seem less meaningful. They did not see it because they were inside. My friends did not see it because they were somewhere else. That does not tell us anything about whether the meteor existed. It only means I was the one looking up. I also wonder whether it could have been space debris rather than a natural meteor. Objects re-entering the atmosphere can create long, bright trails, too. Sometimes they break into multiple glowing pieces. They may remain visible longer than typical meteors because they enter at different speeds and angles. I do not remember seeing multiple fragments, though. My memory is of one main bright object or streak that eventually faded. So a meteor still feels like the simplest explanation. An airplane seems much less likely. Airplanes do not normally cross that much sky in a few seconds. Their lights blink in recognizable patterns. They do not generally appear as a bright, continuous streak that burns out. A satellite would move much more slowly. A normal satellite can take minutes to cross the sky, not seconds. An iridium-style flare or satellite reflection can become very bright and then fade, but the movement would still be much slower than what I remember. So some kind of meteor or atmospheric reentry makes the most sense. That means the funny part is that the event I was accused of imagining was probably not even particularly mysterious. It was unusual, memorable, maybe rare enough that none of my friends had ever seen one like it. But not impossible. There is nothing supernatural about a bright meteor, nothing paranormal. No reason it needed to make the news. I simply happened to see one. That almost makes the disbelief more frustrating. If I had told everyone I saw a ghost, skepticism would be expected. If I said aliens landed in the park, obviously people would want evidence. But a bright meteor, those actually happen. The fact that I did not have another witness did not make it impossible. Still, I understand why my parents reacted the way they did. Children and teenagers exaggerate things. Someone sees a normal shooting star and describes it as a meteor nearly hitting the neighborhood. Someone sees a bright airplane and becomes convinced it was something extraordinary. From their perspective, maybe I was excited and had misidentified something. They probably were not accusing me of deliberately lying as harshly as it felt. Maybe they thought I had seen something, but misunderstood the scale. That would actually be close to my own interpretation now. I probably did see something real. I may have overestimated how dangerous it was. Both can be true. My certainty that we were about to have another Russian-style event was almost certainly fear-talking. The object fading is exactly what you would expect from something burning up safely. That is what meteors normally do. They enter, glow, sometimes fragment. Disappear, the atmosphere did what the atmosphere does. At the time, though, every second it remained visible made me more nervous. 1 second, still there. 2, still moving. 3, why has it not gone out? 4, this is too big. Then, darkness. I remember the relief. No boom, nothing hitting the ground, just night again. It is strange that the lack of a dramatic ending may be exactly why nobody else cared. If there had been a sonic boom, people would have gone outside. If windows shook, somebody would report it. If something struck the ground, obviously it would become news. But because the object disappeared harmlessly, the entire experience remained private. One person and a dog beneath a winter sky. That was it. I wish I had had a smartphone ready. Even then, though, I doubt I could have recorded it. 4 or 5 seconds feels long while watching. It is not long when you have to realize something is happening. Take out a phone, unlock it, open the camera, point toward a dark sky, focus, and record. By the time I did any of that, the object would be gone. That is another reason so many brief sky events remain eyewitness stories. They happen faster than people can document them. If I had already been filming the dog or taking a picture, maybe I could have swung the camera upward. But I was just walking. My eyes were the only recording device available. And eyes are excellent at noticing bright movement, but terrible at preserving exact measurements. So I have a vivid memory, but no proof. That is enough, for me personally. I do not need other people to believe every number. I know something crossed the sky. Sometimes I think about how different the experience would have been if another person had been beside me. If a friend had looked up at the same moment and said, "Holy shit, do you see that?" The story would have felt validated instantly. We would probably have talked about it for years. Instead, because I was alone, everyone else's skepticism became part of the memory. The meteor itself lasted seconds. The frustration lasted much longer. That may be why I still remember the exact feeling of trying to explain it. You tell someone something exciting. They do not ask what direction it went. They do not ask how bright it was. They just give you that expression. Sure, whatever, after enough of that, you stop sharing. I think that happens with a lot of real but unusual experiences. People become reluctant to talk. because they do not want to be treated like they are seeking attention. Then, the lack of reports makes unusual events seem even rarer than they actually are. Maybe several people saw the same media that night, and every one of us decided nobody would care. There is no way to know. I also think the recent Russian impact affected how I told the story afterward. I probably emphasized how deep it seemed, how long it lasted, how certain I was that something bad might happen. Those were genuine feelings, but someone listening may have heard them as claims. He says it almost hit the ground. He says it was another Russian meteor. That was not what I actually knew. I knew only what I saw. The danger was my interpretation. If I could describe it now, I would separate those parts more carefully. Observation, a very bright meteor-like object, crossed a large section of the night sky and remained visible for several seconds before fading. Interpretation at the time, I thought it might be a large object entering deeply enough to cause an impact. Outcome, nothing happened. That version sounds much less unbelievable, but when you are younger and excited, you usually lead with the dramatic part. I thought we were about to get hit by a meteor. People hear that and assume exaggeration. Then they dismiss everything else. That may have been what happened with my parents and friends. There is also a possibility that the object produced a faint sound that I never heard because of distance. Meteors can be visually dramatic, while any sonic effects arrive later or not at all from a particular observer's position. At the time, I probably expected the sound to happen immediately, like in a movie. But light reaches you essentially instantly on human scales, while sound takes time. If the event happened tens of kilometers away, a boom could arrive much later. I do not remember hearing one. Maybe there was none. Maybe any sound was too weak by the time it reached my area. Maybe I had already gone home. That is another reason judging distance from the visual alone would have been difficult. The object could have been much farther away than it looked. I think the biggest lesson from the experience is that something does not have to be unexplained to be extraordinary. I probably know what I saw. A bright meteor. Maybe a fireball. There is no mystery creature, no secret aircraft, no supernatural explanation. Yet it remains one of the most memorable things I have ever seen in the sky. For several seconds, I watched a piece of material hit the atmosphere at enormous speed and become bright enough to catch my attention from the edge of my vision. That is incredible, without adding anything else. The atmosphere destroyed or slowed it before it caused any obvious damage. Then it vanished. I happened to be looking in the right direction. That is enough. If anything, I wish people had simply said, "Wow." Sounds like you saw a really bright meteor. Instead, being told I imagined, it made me question myself more than the event deserved. Could I have misidentified the exact type of object? Yes. Could the duration and distance be a little different from memory? Of course. Could I have completely invented a bright moving light that caused me to stop and stare for several seconds? I do not believe so. There was a real stimulus. My confidence in that has never changed. The dog walk itself was otherwise ordinary. That matters to me. I was not exhausted after staying awake for 2 days. I was not staring at the sky trying to force myself to see something. I was not in the middle of telling ghost stories. The light surprised me. It entered my attention from the side. That spontaneous beginning is one of the reasons the memory feels reliable at its core. I had no expectation to fulfill, no reason to imagine a meteor at that exact second. I simply noticed one. The recent impact story may have shaped my fear, but it did not put the initial light in the sky. Those are separate things. I sometimes wonder how bright it actually was compared with Venus or the moon. I cannot give a useful astronomical magnitude. Again, I was not measuring. I just remember that it was bright enough to immediately stand out against everything around it. Maybe it briefly illuminated a faint trail. Maybe not. Some of those details have become less clear with time. The motion is clearer. Fast, smooth, across the sky. Then, fading. No sudden turn. No hovering. No impossible behavior. Everything about it fits a natural object moving through the atmosphere. That is another reason I am comfortable calling it a meteor-like event rather than a UFO. It behaved exactly the way I would expect a bright meteor to behave. The only unusual part was how spectacular it looked. I think people sometimes underestimate how dramatic natural phenomena can be if they have only seen small versions. A person who has only seen faint shooting stars may think a bright fireball sounds fake. Just like someone who has never seen ball lightning, a huge aurora, or an extreme thunderstorm might think descriptions are exaggerated. Nature has a much wider range than everyday experience teaches us. Sometimes you happen to catch one of the bigger examples. That winter night may have been one of those moments. There is one part of the experience I still find slightly uncomfortable. For those 4 or 5 seconds, I had no control over anything. If the object had been large enough to survive an impact nearby, there would have been nothing meaningful I could do. I was outside holding a dog leash, staring upward. That helplessness was probably part of the fear. The Russian event had shown how suddenly these things can happen. People were driving to work, sitting in offices, going about normal mornings. Then, the sky exploded with light. So while I watched my own meteor, I knew there was at least some real-world basis for being nervous. The probability may have been tiny, but not zero. Then, it burned out, and I remember thinking something like, okay, we're fine. That relief was immediate. Then came excitement. I had seen something amazing. Then came disappointment when nobody believed me. It is funny how the emotional sequence changed so quickly. Fear, relief, excitement, frustration, and finally embarrassment. All because of a few seconds of light. For a while, the disbelief bothered me enough that I stopped mentioning it. I did not want to be the person who kept insisting, I swear I saw it. That only makes people more skeptical. So I let it go publicly. Privately, though, I never doubted the basic event. Whenever I remembered it, I could still see the path. The dark winter sky. That sudden brightness. The way I had to follow it with my eyes. The fading at the end. Those images were too connected to a real moment for me to believe I had imagined the entire thing. What I have changed is the certainty around the interpretation. At the time, huge meteor coming down toward Earth. Now, probably a bright fireball traveling through the upper atmosphere at a distance I had no ability to judge. That explanation makes sense. It also explains why the event could be dramatic to me and irrelevant to the news. No contradiction required. If I saw the same thing now, I think I would react differently. I would still stop. I would still stare. But instead of immediately thinking we're about to get hit, I would probably think, that is an incredible fireball. Then, after it vanished, I would check whether anyone else had reported it. Maybe astronomical groups or local observers would have records. But if I found nothing, I would not take that as proof that I imagined it. Not every meteor gets documented. The sky does not wait for cameras. Sometimes something happens for 5 seconds, and only a few people happen to be looking. That is probably what happened to me. There is no grand mystery, just bad timing when it came to having witnesses. But the disbelief became such a strong part of the experience that, for years, remembering the meteor also meant remembering everyone else's faces. My parents thinking I had imagined it. My friends giving me the look. Me realizing it would be easier to stop talking then keep defending myself. I think that is what frustrated me most. I was willing to be wrong about what exactly it was. I was not willing to accept that I had seen nothing. Those are very different claims. Maybe it was smaller than I thought. Maybe much farther away. Maybe the path was shorter. Maybe it was space debris. Fine, but something bright crossed that sky. I watched it. And there is something satisfying now about realizing that the ordinary explanation actually supports me rather than disproves me. Bright meteors are real. They can last several seconds. They can travel across large apparent distances. They can burn up without hitting the ground. They can happen without becoming major news. Nothing about the experience requires me to have imagined it. If anything, the event makes more sense to me now than it did when I first saw it. The tenser part of the memory is still those first seconds. I am outside with my dog. It is winter. Dark enough that the sky looks empty. Something catches the edge of my eye. I look up. There is a bright object moving fast overhead, not gone instantly. Still there, still traveling. Long enough for the recent images from Russia to enter my mind. Long enough for me to think, oh no. Long enough to wonder whether I am about to hear an explosion. Then the light weakens. The streak fades. The object disappears into darkness. Nothing hits. Nothing shakes. My dog and I keep walking. By the time I reach home, the sky looks completely normal again. No evidence, no mark, no reason for anyone who was indoors to know anything had happened. And maybe that is why I still feel stubborn about it. The whole event left nothing behind except my memory. No crater, no news report, no second witness beside me. Just a few seconds I happened to catch, because I looked up at exactly the right moment. People can believe me or not. I am less bothered by that now. I know memory is imperfect. I know fear probably made the meteors seem closer and more dangerous. I know the exact duration and portion of sky are estimates. But I also know the difference between wondering whether I saw something and remembering that I stopped in the middle of a winter dog walk because a bright object was visibly burning its way across the night. Whatever its exact size was, I saw it. And after years of being made to feel ridiculous for saying so, the simplest answer is still the one I believed before anyone started doubting me. It was a meteor. It burned brightly enough for me to watch it for several long seconds. Then, thankfully, it burned out.
Before the next story begins, thank you for staying here in the dark. If this is your first visit, subscribe to Wickless Night for more true stories made for the late hours, when the world is quiet and every little noise feels important. You can also leave a like and tell me which story has made you look around the room so far. Now, let's continue.
A while ago, a few friends and I rented their grandmother's house for about a year. The house had a little bit of a reputation, but nothing dramatic. Apparently, years before we moved in, someone had claimed to see a ghost there. I never knew much about the story beyond that. There was no long list of strange events, no family legend about someone dying in a particular room, and no constant reports of footsteps or doors opening on their own. As far as I knew, someone had seen something once. Then, nothing much happened afterward. That actually made it easy for me to ignore. I have never really believed in ghosts. Even now, after what happened to me in that house, I would not confidently say I was attacked by one. Most old houses collect stories. Someone sees a shadow. Someone hears a noise. Years later, it becomes a ghost story. I was never the kind of person who entered a room already expecting something supernatural. For most of the time we lived there, the house felt normal. There were a few of us sharing it, so it was rarely silent for long. People coming and going, doors opening, someone cooking, someone watching television, people going to training or work. Normal, shared house life. Then, one morning, I finished a night shift. I got off work at around 7. By the time I arrived home, I was completely exhausted. There was no staying up for breakfast or sitting around talking. I went pretty much straight to bed. Anyone who has worked nights probably knows that strange feeling of going home while the rest of the world is starting its day. People are driving to work. The light outside is getting brighter. Birds are making noise. And all you want is darkness and sleep. That morning, I was tired enough that I fell asleep quickly. I would guess I slept for an hour or two. I was not watching the clock, so I cannot say exactly. Then I woke up in one of the most violent ways I have ever woken up. It felt like someone slapped me across the face. Hard, not a light tap. Not a sensation like something brushing my cheek. I mean what felt like a full-force slap. The kind of slap that instantly snaps you awake. My first reaction was not ghost. My first reaction was the lads. I thought one of my friends had come into the room while I was asleep and hit me as a joke. That was genuinely how physical it felt. There was no period where I slowly woke up and wondered whether something had happened. I came awake immediately with the clear impression that I had just been struck. My room was fairly large. There were also enough places in it where someone could briefly hide from direct view. So when I opened my eyes and did not immediately see anyone, I assumed one of them had ducked behind something. I looked around. Nothing. I sat up. Still nothing. I remember being annoyed more than frightened. I got out of bed and said something like, "Nice one, lads," I expected laughter, or one of them to give themselves away. Nobody answered. That was the first moment where the situation started feeling strange. I checked the room properly. No one. Then I went to check the other bedrooms. Empty. That was when I remembered or realized that the others had gone to training while I was asleep. I was alone in the house. There was nobody there who could have walked into my room, slapped me, and hidden. That changed the entire experience. If one of my friends had stepped out laughing, I would probably have forgotten about it within a week. Instead, I was standing in an empty house trying to understand why I had woken up, feeling like someone had hit me. The strangest part was that my face still felt different. The area where I thought I had been slapped felt sore. Warm, not horribly painful, not injured, but enough that I kept noticing it. That made it harder to dismiss as a dream. If I had simply dreamed someone slapped me and then woken up feeling normal, the explanation would have been obvious. Bad dream. Move on. But there seemed to be a physical after effect. I remember touching my face and thinking, that actually hurt. Later, when my friends came back, I asked them about it. At first, I still wanted to make sure none of them had somehow been involved. They had not. Their explanation was simple. I must have hit myself while sleeping. Maybe my arm moved, maybe I rolled over strangely, maybe I had a dream and slapped my own face. That is possible. I cannot prove it did not happen. But it never felt convincing to me. I know how I usually sleep, and the force I remember did not feel like some loose hand dropping against my cheek. It felt deliberate, sharp, like someone standing beside the bed had swung an open hand into my face. That is why the event stayed with me. I still do not know what caused it. There are ordinary explanations. In fact, there are several. The first is exactly what my friend suggested. Maybe I hit myself. People move much more in their sleep than they realize. We scratch, roll, kick, throw arms around, adjust blankets, touch our faces. A person can wake with scratches they do not remember causing. Someone can hit the wall, knock something from a bedside table, wake with an arm numb because they slept on it. The fact that I normally do not slap myself in my sleep does not mean my body could not make one unusual movement once. I was also exhausted from a night shift. That matters. Sleep after working overnight can be very deep and very strange. Your body's normal sleep schedule is being forced into a different pattern. The light outside says morning. Your brain is trying to treat it like night. You may fall asleep quickly because of exhaustion, but still have unusual transitions between sleep stages. Maybe I was dreaming. Maybe my arm moved as part of the dream. Maybe my hand actually did make contact with my face. If that happened at exactly the moment my brain was waking, the sensation could be remembered as an external slap. The force could also feel greater than it really was. Sudden pain wakes you instantly. When your brain comes online after the sensation has already happened, it has to reconstruct what caused it. The easiest explanation is, someone hit me. That explanation feels especially natural when the sensation is on the face. We associate a sudden flat pain on the cheek with a slap. The brain gives the event a familiar cause. Another possibility is that the physical sensation came first, but nothing actually struck me. Sleep-wake transitions can produce very convincing tactile experiences. People can feel pressure on the chest, someone touching their arm, a hand on the shoulder, something sitting on the bed, a tug on the blanket. Sometimes a person wakes convinced they have been physically touched when there is no external source. That does not mean they are lying. The sensation can be completely real to them. The brain is capable of generating touch just as it can generate dream images and sounds. If I was moving out of a dream state very suddenly, I may have experienced a slap sensation strongly enough to wake me. The warmth afterward would seem like evidence against that, but even warmth can have ordinary causes. A sudden rush of blood to the skin, pressure from sleeping on one side of the face, friction from bedding, my own hand touching the area after waking, adrenaline changing how the skin feels. Once I believed I had been slapped, I was paying close attention to that side of my face. That attention can magnify subtle sensations. A little warmth becomes it is still burning where I was hit. I am not saying that definitely happened, only that it is possible. There are also muscle and nerve sensations that can be surprisingly sudden. A muscle twitch near the jaw or cheek, a nerve firing sharply, a spasm, an abrupt headache or facial pain. If it happened while I was asleep, I might wake with the impression of an impact. Again, without medical evaluation at the time, there is no way to know. The problem is that none of those explanations match the emotional clarity of the memory. I remember the slap. That is how it exists in my mind. Not, I woke with facial pain. I remember being hit. That distinction is why the experience still bothers me. But memory can be extremely confident while still being wrong about cause. That is one of the uncomfortable things about sleep-related experiences. If something happens while you are fully awake in daylight, you have context. You can see the room before and after. You know where your arms were. You know whether someone was beside you. Sleep removes that continuity. I have no memory of the seconds before the slap. I was unconscious. Then, impact. Awake. That gap is where almost any explanation can fit. Maybe my hand was already moving. Maybe I had rolled into the edge of something. Maybe I had been dreaming that somebody hit me. Maybe my face had been pressed awkwardly against the pillow, and a sudden movement created pain. I cannot go back and check. The house being empty made the event stranger, but it also removed the simplest human explanation. No prank, no friend hiding nearby, no one sneaking out of the room. At least, not realistically. Could an unknown person have been in the house? Technically, almost anything is possible. But there was no evidence. No sign of a break-in, nothing missing, no footsteps, no door, no person found inside. And the idea that a stranger entered an occupied house in the morning, walked into my bedroom, slapped me once, then escaped silently, makes far less sense than a sleep-related explanation. So I have never seriously believed it was an intruder. The ghost story attached to the house naturally came back into my mind. Someone had supposedly seen something there before. Now I had an unexplained physical experience. It was easy to connect them. Maybe whatever had been seen years earlier was still there. Maybe it had decided to wake me. Maybe it did not like me sleeping during the day. Maybe it was just being aggressive. Those are the kinds of stories the brain produces when there is a gap in explanation. But there was no actual evidence connecting my experience to the old ghost story. I do not even know what the earlier person claimed to see. Maybe their story had nothing to do with my room. Maybe it had been decades earlier. Maybe they had seen an ordinary shadow and called it a ghost. The fact that two unusual stories happened in the same house does not automatically mean they had the same cause. Old houses have many residents. More residents mean more chances for someone to experience something strange. If 50 people sleep in a building over many decades, eventually someone will have sleep paralysis, a nightmare, hear a weird noise, or wake with an unexplained sensation. Then those stories get attached to the house rather than to the people. That may be all that happened. Still, when you are standing alone in the morning with your face warm from what feels like a recent slap, rational probability is not the first thing you think about. I remember checking the other rooms more carefully than I normally would. Part of me still expected one of my friends to jump out. That would have been comforting. I wanted to be fooled. I wanted somebody to laugh and say, "Got you." No one did. The house stayed quiet. That silence is what shifted the memory from irritating to unsettling. There is something strange about being suddenly awakened by apparent physical contact and then realizing you are the only person in the building. You become aware of the entire house at once. Every room, every hallway, every closed door. You start listening. Was there movement downstairs? Did a floorboard creak? Is someone hiding? Nothing. The place feels bigger because there is nobody else filling it. I went from being completely asleep to completely alert in a matter of seconds. That probably increased the adrenaline. My heart was going. I was annoyed. Then confused. Then slightly creeped out. The emotional sequence may also have made the facial sensation last longer. When you are anxious, the body becomes hyper-aware. You notice temperature, pressure, pain. The smallest sensation becomes important. If I had woken, thought I had rolled awkwardly, and gone straight back to sleep, maybe the warmth would have disappeared from memory. Instead, I spent several minutes investigating, touching my face, looking for people, thinking about being hit. That reinforced every sensation. I have wondered whether I had been sleeping with my hand near my face. Maybe my arm was numb. If a numb hand suddenly fell or swung, I might not initially feel the movement in the arm properly. I would only register the impact. That could make it feel like the force came from somewhere else. Or maybe I had my hand under the pillow and pulled it free suddenly. There are endless possibilities. None feel completely satisfying because I cannot recreate the event, but that does not make the ghost explanation stronger by default. Unexplained is not the same as supernatural. I still believe that, even after this. That is why I have never become a ghost believer, because of what happened. If somebody asked me, "Do you think a ghost slapped you?" I would say I have no idea. Probably not. But I cannot tell you what did. That is the most honest answer. I also think working nights deserves more attention than I gave it at the time. Night shifts can really mess with sleep. Even if you think you are coping well, your body is still working against its natural rhythm. Coming home at 7 in the morning means trying to sleep when the environment is becoming active. Sunlight increases. Traffic starts. Neighbors wake. Sounds change. Your sleep can be deep from exhaustion, but also fragmented. Maybe something outside made a sharp noise at the exact moment I had a dream about being struck. The brain could combine sound and touch. For example, a door slamming somewhere outside might become a slap inside a dream. Then I wake with my cheek pressed against the pillow and interpret the whole experience as physical contact. Dreams can incorporate external sensations incredibly fast. A ringing phone becomes an alarm inside the dream. A blanket falling becomes someone grabbing you. A sound becomes a gunshot. The brain builds a story around whatever wakes it. Maybe that happened. The problem is that I do not remember a dream. But people wake from dreams all the time without remembering them, especially after abrupt waking. I may have lost the entire dream except the final sensation. The slap becomes the only surviving frame. That possibility actually fits well. There is also something called a hypnopompic experience, meaning something unusual that happens while waking from sleep. People can see figures, hear voices, feel someone touch them. Sometimes the experiences are extremely vivid because part of the brain is still operating in a dreamlike state while awareness of the room has already returned. I do not know whether that is what happened to me. I was able to get up immediately and search the house, so I was not stuck or unable to move. But unusual tactile sensations do not have to come with full sleep paralysis. The boundary between sleep and wakefulness is messy. My experience may have lasted only 1 second, long enough to feel a hand hit my face. Then, I was awake. If so, the fact that I was exhausted makes even more sense. Again, that explanation does not mean the slap felt fake. That is the point people often misunderstand. A sensation generated during sleep can feel completely physical. The brain is the thing that normally tells you when you have been touched anyway. If it generates the same signal without an external hand, the experience can be indistinguishable in the moment. You do not wake thinking, "My brain has generated a tactile hallucination." You wake thinking, "Who the hell just hit me?" That was exactly my reaction. I did not question the slap until the physical evidence failed to match it. No person, no open door, no laughter, nothing. There was also no visible mark that I remember, no handprint, no swelling, no bruise. That matters. The area felt sore and warm, but if someone had truly hit me with what I remember as enormous force, you might expect more obvious evidence. Maybe not. A slap can sting badly without leaving a lasting mark. But the lack of visible injury leaves room for a much milder physical event that my waking brain interpreted as stronger than it was. Maybe my own hand hit me lightly enough to create warmth, but the suddenness made it feel huge. The phrase I always use in my head is like being slapped by God himself. That is how intense the waking felt. But intensity of surprise is not the same as measured force. If you are deeply asleep, even a moderate impact can feel enormous. Think about being awakened by a phone falling beside your head. The sound feels catastrophic for a second. Your whole body jumps. The same could apply to touch. I have also wondered whether the soreness came from before I fell asleep. Maybe I had rubbed my face. Maybe something at work irritated the skin. Maybe I had slept with pressure against it. Then I woke suddenly and interpreted an already existing discomfort as the result of the slap. Memory would naturally connect the pain to the moment of waking. Again, possible, not satisfying, but possible. What makes the story interesting to me is how completely certain I was during the first few seconds. There was no mystery initially. Someone slapped me. That was a fact. I was already preparing the response. Nice one, lads. Very funny. I assumed human prank because the sensation was that convincing. Only after searching the house did uncertainty enter. That is almost the reverse of a typical ghost story. I did not hear a noise and decide it was supernatural. I experienced what seemed like an ordinary human action, then discovered there was apparently no human available to perform it. That is what still bothers me. I sometimes imagine what I would have thought if I had known the house had a much stronger haunted reputation. Suppose people had told me a ghost attacks people in that bedroom. Would I have interpreted the event differently from the first second? Probably. Instead of assuming friends, I might have woken already terrified. That shows how expectations shape experience. Because I did not strongly believe in ghosts, my first explanation was a prank. Only later did the old story return. That actually makes me trust my initial sensation somewhat more. I was not trying to create a paranormal event, but it still does not tell me what caused it physically. My skepticism has survived because nothing similar happened again. At least, nothing I remember. I was not slapped every morning. I did not start waking with scratches. No one else reported being hit. There was no escalating series of incidents. The house did not suddenly become active. One weird event happened. Then, life continued. That pattern fits an unusual sleep event much better than an ongoing haunting. If something in the house wanted to physically interact with me, apparently it did it once and lost interest forever. Not impossible if you believe in ghosts, but not strong evidence. A one-time sleep-related event is far more common and requires fewer assumptions. I think that is where I land today. Most likely, something happened during sleep. Maybe my own hand, maybe a muscle jerk, maybe a dream-generated tactile sensation, maybe some combination. The warmth and soreness were real enough to me, but they do not tell me exactly what caused them. There is no need to assume an invisible person in the room. But saying probably sleep-related is not the same as feeling satisfied. I am not. The reason the memory survives is because I never got the moment of proof. If I had woken with my hand resting against my cheek, easy. If I had found a fallen object beside the bed, easy. If a friend confessed, easy. Instead, nothing. I woke, felt hit, searched, empty house. That is all. Sometimes I think about how quickly I got out of bed after it happened. I did not lie there half asleep for 10 minutes. I was awake immediately. That makes the experience feel more real to me. But abrupt waking is exactly when dream and waking sensations can overlap. So even that detail points in both directions. The brain can go from dream to full alertness very fast after a sudden stimulus. By the time I stood up, whatever unusual sleep state existed may have already ended. All that remained was the memory of the slap. My friends joking that I must have hit myself did not help because it felt dismissive. They were not there. They had not felt it. I knew how strong it seemed. But from their perspective, what else were they supposed to say? House empty. You were sleeping. You woke with facial pain. Most likely you did something in your sleep. That is a perfectly sensible conclusion. If one of them told me the same story, I would probably tell them exactly that. Maybe I would joke about it too. It is different when you are the person who felt it. That difference between outside explanation and inside experience is important. From outside, a tired man working night shifts woke suddenly with a painful sensation. From inside, someone slapped me so hard it woke me, and then I discovered nobody was home. Both descriptions are true. They simply emphasize different levels of certainty. I think paranormal stories often live in that gap. The experience feels specific. The evidence is vague. Your brain wants the specificity to matter. If I felt a slap, there must have been a slapper. That is basic logic when awake. But during sleep, cause and sensation can separate. That is probably the key. I am glad I did not immediately decide the house was haunted. I think that would have changed the rest of the year. Every creak would become significant. Every waking sensation would become another attack. I might have started sleeping badly because I expected something. Then poor sleep could produce more strange experiences. A feedback loop. Instead, I remained skeptical. Confused, but skeptical. The house returned to being ordinary. That probably prevented one strange morning from turning into a long, haunting narrative. Still, every now and then, I remember it, especially the first second after waking. My eyes opening, the sting on my face, that instant certainty that somebody was in the room. I can still remember looking around, expecting to catch one of the lads trying not to laugh. Then standing, calling out. No answer. Checking the other rooms, empty beds. Quiet house. That gradual shift is the story for me. Not ghost, not apparition, just absence. The person required to explain the sensation was missing. I also wonder whether the original ghost story influenced my memory afterward more than it did at the time. Maybe years later, when retelling the event, I remembered, oh, right, someone supposedly saw a ghost there once. That makes the slap feel like part of a larger history, that there is no reason to connect them. The previous sighting may have been completely unrelated. The person could have seen something in another part of the house. Maybe they were mistaken. Maybe the story itself changed over time. Without details, it is basically useless as evidence. The only reason it feels relevant is because both events happened under the same roof. People are very good at building patterns from location. This house has two weird stories. Therefore, the house is weird. But a house is where people spend thousands of hours sleeping, waking, dreaming, hearing noises, arguing, getting sick, and seeing things in low light. Of course, some strange memories will collect there. The same is true of schools, hospitals, hotels, and old workplaces. The more life happens somewhere, the more unexplained moments accumulate. Maybe that is all a haunted reputation is sometimes. A collection of normal human anomalies tied to one building. I cannot prove that either, but it makes sense. The experience also reminded me that sleep can be much stranger than most of us give it credit for. We think there is a clean boundary. Awake, then asleep, then awake again. But the brain does not always switch modes instantly. Dream imagery can leak into waking. Sounds can be incorporated into dreams. Bodies can move. People can talk. People can wake confused. Some people even perform complex behaviors and remember none of them. So the idea that my sleeping body or sleeping brain produced one violent feeling sensation is not difficult to accept intellectually. Emotionally, it still feels like someone hit me. That contradiction has never completely gone away. If I had to explain it today, I would probably say I had an unusually vivid tactile awakening after a night shift, possibly combined with an actual movement or impact during sleep. That sounds clinical and boring. It also probably comes closest to the truth, but it does not capture the experience. The experience was waking because an invisible hand seemed to crack across my face. There is a difference, and sometimes the boring explanation does not erase the strange feeling because the brain remembers the event before it remembers the theory. I do not think I will ever know whether my own hand physically made contact. That is the part I would most like to know. If I could see a recording of the room from that morning, I suspect the answer would be embarrassingly simple. Maybe I would watch myself roll over, throw an arm upward, and hit my face. Then I would sit up looking furious. Mystery solved. Or maybe the recording would show me completely motionless until my eyes suddenly opened and I grabbed my cheek. That would be much stranger. There was no camera. So the answer disappeared with those few sleeping seconds. All I have is what I experienced after them. A sore, warm face, an empty room, friends who were not home, and no evidence of anyone entering. That is why I still think about it. Not because I secretly believe I was attacked by a ghost. I do not. At least, not enough to claim it. I think there are better explanations. But every explanation has to compete with the physical clarity of that first moment. The feeling was not subtle. It was not like someone might have touched me. It was not a vague dream. I woke absolutely certain I had been slapped. Then, reality failed to provide the person who had done it. That is the entire mystery. Maybe my brain supplied the hand. Maybe my sleeping body supplied the force. Maybe the warmth was just pressure and adrenaline. All of that is plausible. Probably more plausible than anything supernatural. But whenever I remember that house, I do not think first about the old ghost story. I think about coming home after a 7 a.m. Finish, exhausted enough to fall straight into bed. I think about sleeping for an hour or two. Then, without warning, waking to what felt like the hardest open-handed slap imaginable. I remember sitting up, expecting laughter, getting out of bed, calling for the lads, checking their rooms. Nothing, the house completely empty. And even though I still do not believe in ghosts, there are moments when I remember standing there with the side of my face still warm and sore and thinking the one question I never managed to answer: if nobody was in that room with me. Then, what exactly woke me up? When I was about 13, I had an experience walking home that still bothers me because I never figured out what the man behind me actually wanted. I lived around 15 minutes away from where I had been that day. I do not remember there being anything unusual about the walk at first. It was a route I knew, and at that age I was used to getting around the neighborhood on my own. I was also a pretty big kid for 13. Not necessarily someone who looked like an easy target from a distance. That is one of the reasons the whole thing confused me so much afterward. I was walking normally when I became aware of another set of footsteps behind me. At first, I did not think anything of it. People walk places. If you are on a sidewalk or moving through an apartment neighborhood, eventually somebody is going to be behind you. There was no reason to immediately assume the person was following me. So I kept going. My footsteps, then another person's footsteps behind them. Nothing strange. For a while, I barely paid attention. Then I noticed something about the rhythm. The person behind me seemed to be getting closer. Their footsteps started coming faster. I did not turn around immediately. I think part of that was because I did not want to make the situation awkward if it was nothing. There is always that little social hesitation. You hear somebody behind you, but you do not want to spin around and stare at them like they are a criminal just because they happen to be walking in the same direction. So instead, I increased my speed slightly. Not running, Not even obviously speed walking, just a little faster. The kind of change you make while pretending you are not changing anything. Then the footsteps behind me got faster too. That was when I started paying real attention. I could hear the pattern clearly enough that I knew the distance between us was not increasing. If anything, the person still seemed to be closing the gap. I walked a little faster. They walked a little faster. It became this strange silent exchange where neither of us said anything. I did not look back. The other person did not call out. We just kept increasing our walking speed. At that point, I started getting the feeling that I should not let whoever was behind me get close. I cannot explain that feeling as anything supernatural. There was no voice in my head, no premonition. It was more like my body had noticed enough small things that my conscious mind finally accepted something might be wrong. The footsteps were matching me. That alone was enough. Maybe if the person had simply kept the same speed, I would have relaxed. Maybe if they had passed me, the whole thing would have been over. Instead, every time I tried to create distance, the footsteps seemed to answer by increasing too. That made it feel deliberate. I kept walking. I knew my apartment was not too far away. That gave me something to focus on. Just get home. I do not remember thinking about going into a store or knocking on somebody else's door. At 13, home felt like the obvious safe destination. I knew where I was. I knew how much farther I had to go. And the closer I got to my apartment, the more I started thinking, if I can just reach the building, I am fine. The footsteps stayed behind me. I could still hear them. They had not turned off somewhere. The person had not crossed the street. They were still coming the same way I was. That was when coincidence started feeling less convincing. Of course, someone can have the same route as you. If you live in the same apartment area, that is completely normal. But there is a point where the repeated matching starts to feel different. I speed up. You speed up. I continue for several blocks. You continue. I head directly toward my apartment. You are still there. At 13, I did not have sophisticated language for any of that. I just knew I did not want him reaching me. Eventually, I could see my apartment. That was a huge relief. I kept moving until I reached the front steps. I walked up them. Only then did I turn around. That was the first time I properly saw the person. It was a man. He was dressed in a way that immediately stood out to me. A suit, a trench coat, sunglasses, and he was carrying a briefcase. The sunglasses are one of the details I still remember because they made him look even stranger. Depending on the time of day, sunglasses may not have been unusual by themselves, but combined with the suit, trench coat, briefcase, and the fact that he had apparently been matching my speed for most of the walk, the whole picture felt wrong. He looked almost stereotypical, like somebody trying to look official or anonymous. I know that description sounds like something from a movie. That is exactly why I have questioned it over the years. But that is how I remember him. What he did next was even stranger. He walked quickly directly toward my apartment steps. For a second, I thought he was coming up them. That was probably the moment I was most frightened. I was standing above him near the entrance to my home, and this man I had been hearing behind me for most of the walk was coming straight toward me. Then, just before reaching the steps, he made a sharp turn. He did not stop, did not look up and say anything, did not ask for directions, did not acknowledge me. He simply turned and continued walking the other way. I stood there watching him. That should have been the end of it. Maybe he had just needed to use the sidewalk near my apartment. Maybe his route naturally turned there. Maybe everything before that had been coincidence. But later, I saw him again. He appeared to have circled around the apartment buildings. This time, I saw him walking back in the direction we had originally come from, but approaching from a different route. That made the entire thing feel even less normal. If his destination had simply been somewhere past my apartment, why circle around? If he had been headed somewhere specific, why return toward where we started? Maybe there was a perfectly ordinary reason. But from my perspective, it looked like he had followed me to my building, avoided actually coming up the steps once I turned to face him, then looped around the apartment complex and headed back. I never found out why. That is what still creeps me out. Nothing actually happened. The man never touched me. He never spoke to me. He never threatened me. I never saw a weapon. He did not try to force his way into my apartment. He did not continue following me after I reached home. So I cannot honestly say he intended to hurt me, but I also cannot completely convince myself that the entire thing was coincidence. The matching footsteps are what keep bothering me. When someone behind you speeds up once, that can mean nothing. Maybe they are in a hurry. If you speed up and they continue closing the distance, still possible. But when you repeatedly increase your pace and the person behind you seems to do the same, your brain starts paying attention for good reason. Humans are very sensitive to being followed. We notice repeated movement patterns. That instinct can produce false alarms, but it also exists because matching behavior sometimes really does indicate another person's interest in you. My body recognized that before I had any proof. I remember thinking, do not let him get close. That was enough to keep me moving. Looking back, there are several possible explanations. The simplest is that he was not following me at all. Maybe he lived in the same area. Maybe his route overlapped with mine almost perfectly. Maybe he was late for something and naturally walking faster. I increased my pace, but perhaps he would have increased his anyway. Then, when we reached my apartment, maybe his route turned beside the steps. The sharp turn only looked suspicious because I was finally watching him. And the later sighting could have been part of his normal route through the apartment complex. Maybe he was looking for a specific building. Maybe he had the wrong address. Maybe he was delivering something. He had a briefcase. That could fit someone working. A salesman, insurance agent, lawyer, business employee, someone attending a meeting. Maybe he was walking around trying to find an apartment number. That would explain circling. The sunglasses and trench coat may also sound more suspicious now than they were at the time. A trench coat is just a coat. A suit is normal business clothing. A briefcase was once much more common than it is now. Sunglasses are normal. Put all four together and memory creates mysterious man. But each item individually has an ordinary explanation. Maybe I remember the clothes so strongly because they looked unusual compared with the way most people dressed in my neighborhood. At 13, an adult wearing formal business clothes could automatically seem strange. There is also the possibility that he noticed me speeding up and misinterpreted my behavior. Maybe from his perspective, a large teenage boy in front of him suddenly started walking faster. Perhaps he thought I was nervous. Maybe he was trying to pass me. So he sped up. Then I sped up again. He sped up more. Because now we were both awkwardly trying to change positions without saying anything. Two people can accidentally create a strange pattern like that. You have probably experienced something similar in a hallway. You step left to avoid somebody. They step the same direction. You step right. So do they. For a few seconds, both people keep mirroring each other. It feels intentional, even though it is not. Maybe our walking speeds created the same kind of feedback. I hear him getting closer. I speed up. He wants to pass, so he speeds up. I interpret that as pursuit and speed up again. He increases again because I am still in front of him. Now both of us are rapidly walking for completely different reasons. That could happen, but if he wanted to pass, he never actually did. That is the problem. He stayed behind me all the way to the apartment. Maybe the sidewalk was narrow. Maybe he did not want to get too close to a kid. Maybe he eventually decided not to pass. Still possible. Another explanation is that he really was following me, but not for a harmful reason. Maybe he thought I was someone else. Perhaps I resembled a person he was trying to find. Maybe he was a private investigator, debt collector, process server, or someone looking for an address. The suit and briefcase make those ideas tempting, but I have no evidence for them. That is probably my imagination trying to give the clothes a purpose. I was 13. There was no obvious reason for some professional-looking stranger to follow me. Maybe he was looking for an adult connected to the apartment and assumed I lived there. Once I reached the steps, he learned the location he needed. Then he circled away. That is possible. It is also possible he was trying to see where I lived. That is a much less comfortable explanation. Maybe he had noticed me somewhere earlier. Maybe he intentionally followed me to learn my address. Once I turned around and got a clear look at him, he realized I was aware of him. So instead of approaching, he made the sharp turn. Then he circled the apartments to avoid looking like he had been following me. That interpretation fits the behavior disturbingly well. But fitting does not mean proven. There are no later events supporting it. He did not return, as far as I remember. I did not see him watching the apartment afterward. No one contacted my family. Nothing happened. If he had been deliberately stalking me, the behavior apparently ended that same day. That makes a harmless explanation easier to accept. There is also a darker possibility that I cannot completely ignore. Maybe he had some intention to approach me, but changed his mind once I reached the steps and turned around. Sometimes simply showing that you are aware of someone changes a situation. A person who hopes to surprise you loses that advantage once you are facing them. If the man had bad intentions, maybe seeing me standing at my apartment entrance made the situation less useful to him. I was a big 13-year-old. I was now close to a building where family or neighbors might appear. I had seen his face and clothing. Maybe he decided to leave. That would explain the sudden turn. Again, though, I have no evidence. He never actually attempted anything. Calling him a predator or attacker based only on this encounter would be unfair. Suspicious behavior is not proof of criminal intent. What I can say is that his behavior made me uncomfortable enough that I remember it years later. That is valid by itself. Sometimes you do not need to know someone's exact intention to recognize that maintaining distance was sensible. If a stranger appears to be matching your pace for 15 minutes, there is no harm in taking precautions. The fact that I was a big kid does not really change that. Size can reduce some risks, but not all. I used to think, why would anyone follow me? I was huge for my age. But being physically large does not make someone immune to being robbed, manipulated, assaulted, or targeted for some other reason. Maybe the man did not realize I was 13. Maybe from behind I looked older. Maybe size had nothing to do with why he was there. Or maybe he never wanted anything from me in the first place. That is the maddening part. I cannot know. I think the briefcase also made the situation more memorable. because it created such a specific silhouette. A man in a trench coat carrying a briefcase sounds almost fictional. If he had been wearing jeans and a sweatshirt, maybe I would have remembered only some guy. Instead, his clothes gave the memory a character. That can also distort things. Over time, the details that fit the creepy story become stronger. Suit, trench coat, sunglasses, briefcase, sharp turn, circling the apartments. It sounds like a spy movie. Maybe the real man looked less dramatic. Maybe the coat was just a long jacket. Maybe the briefcase was a work bag. Maybe the sunglasses were ordinary dark glasses. Memory compresses categories. Still, I do not think the core sequence is invented. I heard footsteps. They seemed to increase speed when I did. The man continued behind me until I reached my apartment. I turned. He came quickly toward the steps, then turned sharply away. Later, I saw him looping back. That is enough to explain why 13-year-old me felt uneasy. I also think it is interesting that I did not run. I walked faster, but I did not sprint. Maybe I did not want to show fear. Maybe I worried that running would make him run too. Maybe I still hoped the situation was nothing. There is something psychologically strange about potentially being followed. Part of you wants to escape immediately. Another part does not want to overreact. You keep negotiating with yourself. He is probably just walking. No, he sped up. Maybe he is in a hurry. Why is he still behind me? Do not look. Just keep going. Maybe he turns at the next street. He does not. That internal argument can continue much longer than you would expect. By the time you become convinced enough to act, you may already be close to your destination. That seems to be what happened to me. Home became the goal. Seeing the apartment gave me enough confidence to keep moving normally. In retrospect, walking directly to my own front door may not have been the safest choice if I genuinely believed someone was following me. It told him where I lived. A better option could have been going somewhere occupied, approaching another group of people, or contacting an adult before leading the person home. But I was 13. Home meant safety. That was the entire calculation. I did not think, do not reveal your address. I thought, get to the place where my family is. That is understandable. And fortunately, nothing followed from it. I think turning around on the steps was important. For most of the walk, the man may have believed I had not looked at him. Then, suddenly, I was elevated on the stairs, facing him directly. He knew I saw him. If his intentions were innocent, maybe he simply continued his route. If they were not, maybe that moment discouraged him. Either way, the interaction changed once we made visual contact. The fact that he did not speak is another thing that creeps me out. If he had been trying to ask for directions, that would have been the obvious time. If he wanted a particular apartment, he could have said, "Excuse me, do you know where building number whatever is?" He did not. He simply turned. That made him feel less like somebody who needed help and more like somebody who did not want to explain why he was there. But maybe he did not need anything from me. Maybe the turn was his route. A person is not required to explain themselves just because a nervous kid thinks they have been followed. That is the balance I try to keep when remembering it. Trust the discomfort. Do not invent guilt. Those are both possible at the same time. I had a good reason to create distance. I do not have enough information to say the man intended harm. The later circling is probably the most suspicious part. I remember seeing him again from another direction, walking back toward where we had originally come from. That seemed to confirm he had no real destination beyond following me. But apartment complexes are confusing. Paths loop around. People take wrong turns. Maybe he was searching for someone. Maybe he realized he had passed the building he wanted. Maybe he was killing time before an appointment. Maybe he was exercising in business clothes for some reason. There are endless mundane explanations. What my 13-year-old brain saw was simpler. He followed me. I reached home. He turned away. Then he circled back. That interpretation became the memory. I wish I had told an adult immediately and had someone watch where he went. Maybe my parents could have recognized him. Maybe he was a neighbor's relative. Maybe someone would have said, "Oh, that's the insurance guy. He's been visiting the building all afternoon." Mystery solved. Or maybe they would have had no idea who he was and told me not to walk alone for a while. Either outcome would have been useful. Instead, the encounter remained unresolved. And unresolved human encounters can be creepier than paranormal ones because there is no need to believe in anything unusual. A real person can follow you. A real person can hide their intentions. A real person can change direction once they realize you are aware of them. That is all physically possible. At the same time, coincidence can imitate those same behaviors. That is why it is so difficult to judge an encounter like this years later. You do not get access to the other person's thoughts. Maybe his entire internal story was, "I'm late. Why is this kid walking faster? I need to get around him. Actually, my turn is here. Wrong building. I need to circle back." Meanwhile, my story was, "This stranger is following me home." Both experiences could occur during the same 15-minute walk. That is entirely possible. But I still remember the instinct. Do not let him get close. I have learned to respect that kind of feeling without treating it as supernatural intuition. Your brain notices things before you can always explain them. Distance, pace, direction, whether someone repeatedly mirrors you. Maybe I had unconsciously noticed him staying exactly behind me through turns, where most pedestrians would have separated. Maybe I noticed his footsteps getting closer more consistently than I can describe now. Those small details combined into discomfort. That does not prove danger, but it is enough to justify caution. I am glad I did not stop. Glad I did not turn around in an isolated spot and confront him. Glad I reached home without him approaching. Even if he was completely innocent, nothing was lost by keeping distance. I sometimes wonder whether he knew how young I was. From behind, probably not. I was a big kid. Maybe he thought I was an adult or older teenager. If he really was following me for some reason, perhaps he was surprised when I reached the steps and turned around. Maybe seeing my face made him realize I was a child. That could even explain the sudden turn. Again, speculation. There are too many ways to interpret one movement. Maybe he was not surprised at all. Maybe he never looked at me closely. I cannot remember his facial expression. That is important. I remember the clothes far more clearly than the face. That suggests I may not have gotten a good look at him. The sunglasses hid his eyes. The brief moment of seeing him was more about his overall appearance and route than his features. If I could see the scene again now, I wonder whether it would look as threatening. Maybe the distance between us would be greater. Maybe his pace would look normal. Maybe the sharp turn would clearly line up with a walkway. Maybe I would immediately understand where he was going. Or maybe watching it again would make the situation look worse. Maybe I would see how deliberately he maintained the distance behind a 13-year-old. No way to know. That uncertainty is why the memory survives. I do not think about it constantly. Nothing happened afterward to turn it into a bigger story. But every now and then, I remember those footsteps, especially the way they seemed to respond to mine. That is the part that comes back before I even picture the man. My steps get faster. His get faster. I try again. Still behind me. It is such a simple thing. No words, no contact. But when you are alone and young, hearing another person's pace change with yours can make the entire street feel different. Suddenly you stop walking somewhere. You are trying to maintain distance. Every intersection becomes important. Every turn is a test. Will he keep going? Will he turn too? When he continues, the nervousness grows. By the time I saw my apartment, I was no longer casually walking home. I was trying to reach safety without triggering whatever I feared might happen if he got close. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe that reaction prevented something. Both possibilities exist. The encounter never gave me enough information to choose between them. What I do know is that once I stood on those steps and finally looked back, the man did not behave in a way that reassured me. A tall adult in a suit and trench coat, sunglasses on, briefcase in hand, moving quickly straight toward the same steps I had just climbed. Then, the second I was facing him, a sharp turn. No greeting, no explanation, just walking away. Then later somehow, seeing him coming back around from another direction. That is an odd sequence, even if every individual action has an innocent explanation. I think that is the fairest way to describe it. Odd. Not proof of an attempted crime, not proof he was stalking me. But enough to justify why a 13-year-old remembered it. There is also something unsettling about never knowing whether another person was aware of how frightened you were. Maybe he could tell. Maybe he heard my pace increasing and knew exactly why. Maybe he was amused. Maybe he was worried that I thought he was following me and deliberately turned away at the steps to show he was not. That is another possibility I had not considered when I was younger. Perhaps he realized the situation looked bad. Imagine being a tall adult man walking behind a kid. The kid keeps speeding up. You realize he is nervous. You do not want to approach or scare him further. When he reaches his apartment and turns, you deliberately make a sharp turn away instead of passing directly beside him. Then you circle around to reach wherever you were actually going. From that perspective, the behavior could have been considerate. The exact same movements become completely different once intention changes. That possibility actually makes me feel better. Maybe he was trying not to frighten me. But if that were true, why did he keep matching my speed beforehand? Maybe because he was simply walking faster. Again, no answer. I think people sometimes want creepy stories to end with certainty. The stranger was definitely dangerous, or definitely harmless. Reality rarely provides that. Most unsettling interactions end with ambiguity. You notice something, you take precautions, nothing happens. Then years later, you wonder whether the precautions were unnecessary or exactly what kept nothing from happening. There is no way to test the alternate version. What if I had stopped? What if I had let him catch up? Maybe he would have walked past without looking at me. Then I would feel silly. Maybe he would have spoken to me. Maybe something worse. I am glad I never found out. That is probably the only conclusion I can make. I do not need to know what he wanted to know that maintaining distance was the right decision. If somebody's behavior feels strange when you are alone, especially as a kid, you do not owe them the benefit of the doubt at the expense of your own safety. You can be cautious without accusing them of anything. That is exactly how I think about the man now. Maybe he was innocent. Maybe he was lost. Maybe his route through the apartment complex just happened to overlap with mine. Maybe the entire 15 minutes was one long coincidence. But 13-year-old me heard another pair of footsteps gradually speeding up behind his own. Every attempt to create space seemed to fail. The footsteps followed all the way home. And when I finally reached my apartment steps and turned around, there he was, close enough that I could finally see the suit, the trench coat, the sunglasses, and the briefcase, walking quickly straight toward me, then turning away at the last possible moment. I never saw him approach me again. I never learned his name. I never learned why he was there. And maybe there was never anything to learn. But even now, whenever I remember those footsteps changing speed behind mine, I still get the same feeling I had at 13. Whatever that man was doing, I am glad I never let him get close enough for me to find out. About a year ago, my younger brother and I saw something outside a local pub that we still have no explanation for. It was around 9 at night. We had gone to the pub and stepped outside for a smoke. Nothing unusual was happening. We were just standing there talking, probably half paying attention to the parking lot and half talking about whatever had come up that evening. It was dark, but not completely dark. There was a floodlight covering part of the parking area, so we could see people and vehicles well enough. Maybe not perfectly, but this was not one of those situations where we were trying to identify something 50 yards away in total darkness. Then, 2 pickup trucks pulled into the parking lot. I do not remember anything about them immediately seeming suspicious. They were just 2 trucks arriving at a pub. One stopped, then the other. 2 men got out of one of them. The driver of the second truck stayed inside. That was the first detail that became strange only after we saw what happened next. The 2 men walked around to the bed of their truck. My brother and I were still standing there smoking. We were not trying to spy on anyone. They were simply in our line of sight. Then both men reached into the truck bed at the same time. Whatever they were lifting was apparently heavy or awkward enough that it took both of them. Together, they pulled out a huge black bag. My brother looked at me. I looked at him. It was one of those moments where neither person has to say anything, because you can tell immediately that the other person has had exactly the same thought. That looks like a body bag. I know how dramatic that sounds. That is why I have always been careful about saying it looked like a body rather than claiming that it actually was one. We never opened the bag. We never saw a hand or foot. We never saw blood. We never saw a face. All we saw was a large black bag with enough size and weight to make 2 adult men handle it together. But from where we were standing, the shape inside it looked disturbingly human-sized. It did not look like an empty bag. It seemed to sag and move under its own weight as they lifted it. And the outline was close enough to a person lying inside that both my brother and I immediately noticed it. The 2 men carried it to the other pickup. The driver of that truck still did not get out. That part made the whole thing feel more deliberate. The second truck seemed to be there for one purpose: receive the bag. Then, leave. The men lifted the bag into it. I cannot remember whether they put it in the bed or somewhere else in the vehicle, but I clearly remember the transfer. 1 truck, 2 men, huge black bag. Other truck. Then, the second truck pulled away almost immediately. No one stood around talking. The driver did not come into the pub with them. As soon as the bag was transferred, that vehicle left. The 2 men who had moved it went inside the pub. My brother and I stayed outside staring at each other. For a second, I think both of us were waiting for the other person to say something first. Then it was basically, what the hell did we just see? The obvious, horrible explanation had already entered both our minds. A body. It looked like two men had transferred a body from one pickup truck to another in a pub parking lot. But that sounded ridiculous. People do not usually transport dead bodies openly underneath floodlights outside a public business with witnesses standing nearby. At least you would hope they do not. If these men had actually been trying to conceal a murder, doing the transfer right there seemed incredibly stupid. That was one of the main things that made me question my own interpretation. Maybe it only looked like a body because of the bag. There are plenty of large black bags, tent bags, sports equipment, inflatable equipment, tools, hunting gear, carpet, clothing, camping supplies, a folded canopy, construction material, a large duffel, even rubbish or something being taken for disposal. Put any heavy, irregular object inside a flexible black bag, and it can start looking disturbingly human from the wrong angle. Humans are very good at seeing human shapes, especially when something is roughly the length and width of a person. A large bag does not need arms and legs clearly visible for your brain to decide body. Maybe that was all it was. But at the time, the resemblance felt strong enough that neither my brother nor I could immediately laugh it off. The fact that two men lifted it together also made it worse. If one person had casually thrown a light bag into another truck, we probably would not have thought anything about it. Instead, both men took hold of it, lifted, carried, threw, or loaded it into the other vehicle. The whole thing looked like the bag contained something substantial. And whatever it was, the second truck seemed to leave as soon as it received it. My brother and I talked about it for a while. We had been drinking, but we were not completely out of it. That is another detail I always feel the need to explain, because whenever alcohol is involved, people naturally wonder how reliable the observation was. We were at a pub. Yes, we had been drinking. But we were not so intoxicated that we could not identify two pickup trucks, two men, and a large black bag under a floodlight. Both of us saw the same thing. The question was not whether a bag had been transferred. The question was what was inside it. That distinction matters. As we kept talking, our curiosity started winning over common sense. At some point, we decided to ask one of the men. I am still not sure whether that was a smart decision. If the bag was something completely innocent, we would look ridiculous. If it was something illegal, walking up to one of the people involved and saying, essentially, hey, were you just moving a body? Was probably not a great idea either. But after thinking about it long enough, we wanted an answer. One of the two men was still inside the pub. We approached him. I do not remember our exact wording. It was probably not especially polite or carefully phrased. Something along the lines of, what the hell was in that bag? Or, what did we just see you guys moving outside? His reaction was immediate. He became upset. Not confused in a lighthearted way. Not amused. He did not laugh and say, oh, that? It was camping equipment. He did not explain anything. Instead, he got angry. He called us crazy. Then, he finished or slammed down his beer and left. That reaction is the detail that kept the story alive for me. If he had simply explained the bag, the whole thing probably would have ended right there. Suppose he had said, it's a tent. Fine, maybe we would still joke about how much it looked like a body. But mystery solved. Instead, he acted as though the question itself offended or alarmed him. He left quickly. That made us even more suspicious. At the same time, getting angry does not prove guilt. That is important. Imagine being an ordinary person carrying something completely legal. Two strangers who have been drinking walk up to you in a pub and accuse you, directly or indirectly, of moving a dead body. You might get angry too. You might think, what kind of idiots are these? You might not feel obligated to explain your private business. Calling us crazy and leaving could have been a perfectly normal reaction to a ridiculous accusation. Maybe we embarrassed him. Maybe he was already in a bad mood. Maybe he thought we were trying to start a fight. A defensive reaction can look suspicious even when someone has done nothing wrong. That is why I cannot use his behavior as proof. But in the moment, it did not feel reassuring. It felt like we asked the wrong question. The way he left only added to that impression. For the rest of the night, my brother and I kept returning to the same possibilities. What if it really was a body? What if we had just watched evidence of some crime being transferred in front of us? What if we should have called the police? Then, the more rational part would answer, if it was a body, why would they do that here? Why come to a pub afterward? Why move it under a light where other people can see? Why not wrap it more carefully? Why not use a van? Why let the two witnesses who saw you stand right there? Criminal behavior can be stupid. Obviously, people make terrible decisions. But the setting seemed almost too public. That pushes me toward the idea that what we saw was probably something legal and ordinary that just happened to look disturbing. There are many things people transport in pickup trucks that require two people to lift. A large piece of machinery wrapped in black plastic. A folded inflatable boat. Hunting equipment. Animal carcasses. Sports gear. Furniture cushions compressed into a bag. A rolled tent. A heavy bag of clothing. Industrial material. Even a large dog bed or padded item could create a human-like outline. There is another possibility that is unpleasant, but completely legal. It could have been an animal carcass. If someone had been hunting, a deer or other large animal wrapped or bagged for transport could look very similar to a human body from a distance. Depending on where this happened and local hunting practices, that would not be extraordinary. It might even explain why the man became angry when we approached him. Maybe he thought we were accusing him of something criminal over hunting equipment or an animal. Again, I do not know. The black bag itself may also have been less body bag shaped than memory makes it now. That is something I think about. We saw a strange event. Immediately said, that looks like a body bag. Then spent the next hour discussing whether we had seen a body. Once that label was attached, every time we remembered the bag, the memory probably became more connected to the familiar image of a body bag from television and movies. Years later, I picture something long, black, and obviously person-shaped. Was it really that clear? Maybe. My brother remembers the same basic thing. But shared interpretation can strengthen memory too. We looked at each other. We both thought body. Then, we talked about it repeatedly. Our memories did not develop independently after that moment. They reinforced each other. That does not mean the bag was not strange. It means I cannot use the fact that both of us later described it as body-shaped as perfect evidence that it truly had a human outline. The physical event itself is certain enough. Two trucks arrived. Two men removed a large, heavy-looking black bag from one vehicle. They transferred it into the other. The second driver stayed in the truck. The second truck left immediately. The two men entered the pub. Later, when confronted, one became angry and left. Everything beyond that is interpretation. I think the driver staying in the second truck still bothers me because it makes the scene feel organized. There was no reason for him to get out. He was waiting. The bag arrived. He left. That looks like an exchange. But exchanges happen constantly for innocent reasons. Someone says, "Meet me at the pub and I'll give you that equipment." The other person pulls in, does not bother turning the engine off. They transfer it. He leaves. The first men go inside for a beer. Completely normal. From their perspective, maybe there was nothing secretive about it at all. That would even explain why they did it openly. They were not hiding because there was nothing to hide. The very fact that they carried the bag in plain view may be evidence against anything criminal. That is probably the strongest rational argument. People trying to conceal a corpse generally do not want witnesses. They choose isolation, darkness without floodlights, a garage, private property, somewhere away from a busy pub. These men apparently behaved as though nobody watching mattered. Maybe because nobody watching mattered. The man's anger afterward could then come from being accused of something absurd. There is also the possibility that the second driver had a reason not to get out. Maybe mobility issues. Maybe he was in a rush. Maybe parking badly. Maybe just lazy. The quick departure may have had nothing to do with the contents. Maybe he was dropping off or collecting something on the way somewhere else. Normal actions can become ominous when viewed as part of a suspected crime. Once we had decided the bag looked like a body, everything afterward supported that story. Driver stays inside. Suspicious leaves immediately. Suspicious men go into pub. Suspicious man gets angry. Very suspicious. But if we start with they were transferring equipment, the same details become ordinary. Driver waits because it will take 1 minute. Leaves because he has somewhere to go. Men enter pub because that is why they were there. Man gets angry because 2 drunk strangers accuse him of transporting a corpse. Same sequence. Entirely different meaning. That is what makes the experience so hard to judge. Context changes everything. There is another uncomfortable possibility. Maybe it really was connected to something illegal, but not a body. Contraband, stolen property, drugs, weapons, something the men did not want us asking about. A large bag could contain many things. The defensive reaction would make sense without involving murder. But again, there is no evidence for any of that. The bag may have contained gardening supplies, for all I know. When you do not know, imagination tends to choose the most dramatic option. A body-shaped black bag immediately pulls the mind toward death. That is why body bag became the phrase. Had it been a large cardboard box, we might have wondered about stolen electronics instead. The container itself shapes the story. I sometimes wonder whether we should have called the authorities at the time. That is difficult. We had witnessed something suspicious-looking, but not clearly illegal. No one was being attacked. No blood. No visible body. No cry for help. No license plate information that I remember. Calling and saying we saw 2 men move a large black bag between trucks and it looked like a body would at least have created a report. Maybe someone could have checked. But maybe police would have found 2 embarrassed men transporting equipment. At the time, we decided questioning the guy directly was enough. Looking back, if I genuinely believed a human body might have been inside, approaching him ourselves was probably the worst choice. If someone is potentially involved in serious violence, confronting them is unnecessary risk. Better to keep distance. Remember details. Vehicle descriptions. License plates if safely possible. Then let professionals decide whether it is worth checking. We did the teenage or young adult version instead. Curiosity first. Safety later. Luckily, nothing happened. The man got angry and left. He did not threaten us. He did not follow us. Nobody from the trucks returned looking for us. Nothing else happened. That lack of aftermath also makes a serious crime feel less likely, though it does not rule one out. If we had unknowingly witnessed criminals moving a body and then directly confronted one of them, you might expect at least some concern about witnesses. Instead, the man simply left. Maybe he decided two people making a weird accusation were not worth dealing with. That is consistent with innocence. I also do not remember seeing anything in the news afterward. No missing person connected to that pub. No body discovered nearby that made us suddenly think that was it. No police investigation we heard about. Nothing, of course. Crimes happen without becoming news people notice. But a lack of any later connection leaves no support for the worst interpretation. So today, if someone forced me to guess, I would say it probably was not a human body. Probably some large piece of cargo that looked horrifying from our angle, but probably does not erase the memory. The reason it stays with me is because of how immediate both our reactions were. We did not first joke, imagine if that's a body. We looked at each other because the shape itself suggested it. That is different. Maybe it was still a mistake, but it was a convincing one. I can picture the two men reaching into the bed together, the black material coming up, the weight shifting, the way it bent, the size, then them moving it across to the other truck. I can remember thinking, that looks exactly like something you would put a person in. The pub setting made the scene surreal. There were probably lights in the windows, people talking inside, cars nearby, normal evening activity. And in the middle of it, two men doing something that looked like the beginning of a crime documentary. No one else seemed to react. Maybe no one else noticed. Or maybe someone saw it and immediately recognized the object for what it actually was. That is another possibility. Maybe another person inside knew, oh, they're moving their fishing gear. Meanwhile, my brother and I were outside building a murder theory. That thought makes me laugh now. But only a little, because then I remember the man's reaction. That is the hook I cannot quite let go of. Why not just tell us? If two strangers asked me why I had moved a huge bag, and the answer was harmless, I like to think I would say, it's camping equipment, you idiots. Then laugh. But not everyone responds that way. Some people hate being questioned, especially by strangers, especially after drinking, especially if the question sounds accusatory. Maybe he felt we were calling him a murderer to his face. Getting furious would not be shocking. Maybe slamming the beer down and leaving was his way of avoiding a fight. From his perspective, he might even have thought we were dangerous or looking for trouble. That is a possibility I did not consider at the time. Two guys approach you in a pub after watching you in the parking lot. They start questioning what you had in your truck. Maybe you think, why are these people watching me? Why do they care? Who are they? Then you leave because you do not want confrontation. That interpretation makes his response much less suspicious. The biggest weakness in our body theory was always the lack of any visible proof. We saw only the bag. A black bag is designed to hide what is inside. That means the entire conclusion came from shape and movement. Shapes are unreliable. Imagine a rolled sleeping bag inside a large duffel with several heavy items beside it. The middle sags. One end sticks out. Two people lift instant human silhouette. Or a folded tent with poles. Long and rigid in some parts, soft in others. Same effect. Maybe a large piece of sports equipment. Maybe something from a job site. The human body has a fairly simple overall shape when completely covered. It does not take much for random cargo to imitate it. There are stories of people calling police over bodies beside roads that turn out to be rolled carpets, mannequins, rubbish bags, or sleeping bags. Our brains are biased toward detecting people because missing a human-shaped threat would historically be more dangerous than mistakenly seeing one. So we err on the side of person. That may be exactly what happened. Still, I would love to know what was actually inside, even if the answer was boring. Especially if the answer was boring. After a year of occasionally wondering whether we witnessed something terrible hearing, it was an inflatable kayak would be satisfying. Mystery gone. Unfortunately, the only person we asked refused to answer, so the bag remains whatever our imagination wants it to be. My brother and I still occasionally mention it, and because we both witnessed the same event, neither of us can completely dismiss it as one person's drunken misperception. We can question the interpretation, but not the transfer itself. That is an important difference. If I had been alone, maybe after a year I would think, I probably imagined how body-shaped it was. With my brother there, I know someone else had the same immediate reaction. But again, two people can misidentify the same object, especially when they are standing beside each other and looking from the same angle. Shared observation confirms the stimulus, not necessarily the conclusion. I have become much more comfortable with that distinction. Something happened. We do not know what it meant. That is better than forcing certainty. If it was innocent, then calling these men murderers would obviously be wrong. If it was criminal, we have no evidence to establish what kind. So the most accurate version is exactly what we saw. A huge black bag, heavy enough for two men, human-sized enough to disturb both of us, transferred rapidly between pickup trucks. One driver stays in the vehicle, leaves immediately. The men go into the pub. One later becomes extremely upset when asked about it. That is all. The rest is the gap. And gaps are where creepy stories live. The human mind hates an empty explanation. It wants to fill it. If the man had said nothing but, none of your business, maybe we would have felt differently. Instead, calling us crazy almost felt like an attempt to deny something we clearly saw. But perhaps he was not denying the bag. Maybe he was denying our body interpretation. You're crazy could simply mean you seriously think that was a corpse? From his perspective, maybe that was the most accurate response. We probably did sound crazy. There is another reason the event stayed with me. The men themselves apparently acted calm before we questioned them. No nervous scanning of the parking lot. No rushing in panic. No attempt to hide the transfer from the floodlight. That is behavior I would expect from people who believed what they were doing was normal. The more I think about it, the more that weighs against the body theory. Even inexperienced criminals understand basic concealment. Maybe not all of them, but carrying a body openly through a lit pub parking lot while witnesses smoke nearby would be exceptionally reckless. Then, going inside for a beer afterward, it sounds almost absurd. Unless they were so confident nobody would recognize the bag that they did not care. But that requires extra assumptions. The simpler answer is that there was nothing illegal inside. Maybe that is why the driver of the second truck left immediately. The exchange was planned because someone was picking up an item. Done, he had somewhere else to be. And the two men went inside because they had already planned to drink there. Normal, the only abnormal thing was how the bag looked to us. That is where I generally land now. But then every once in a while, my memory gives me the image again. The two men lifting together, the bag hanging between them, the weight, the shape. And I think, no, that looked really bad. Maybe that tension will never disappear. There are experiences where the most likely explanation and the visual memory do not emotionally agree. Rationally, probably cargo. Emotionally, that looked like a body. Both remain. I do not believe we witnessed a murder. We certainly did not witness anyone being killed. At most, if our worst interpretation were correct, we might have seen the transport of someone already dead. But there is no proof of even that. I think it is important not to inflate the story into something it was not. No blood, no screams, no threats, no visible corpse, nothing supernatural either. Just an unexplained human situation. Those can be creepier because they are plausible. If someone tells you they saw a ghost carrying a body bag, you can dismiss it. If two ordinary men transfer a heavy black bag between trucks and become angry when asked about it, there is nothing impossible to hide behind. It could happen exactly as remembered. You simply cannot know what it means. If I could redo the night, I would handle it differently. I would not confront the man. I would discreetly note the vehicles, maybe the license plates if possible, without getting closer. I would talk with my brother and decide whether the situation seemed suspicious enough to report. Then I would leave it there. No accusation, no pub confrontation. Let someone else determine whether anything needed checking. Because the truth is that if the bag really had contained a body, approaching someone involved was foolish. And if it did not, we unnecessarily accused a stranger of something horrible. Neither outcome makes confrontation a good idea. At least nothing came of it. The man left. We finished our night. Life continued. No one came looking for us. We never heard anything that explained the trucks. My brother and I were left with the same question we started with. What the hell was in that bag? Maybe it was equipment. Maybe hunting gear. Maybe something for work. Maybe an animal. Maybe a huge amount of rubbish. Maybe something illegal but less dramatic than what we imagined. And yes, there is still that uncomfortable possibility that our first reaction was correct. I just do not think the evidence lets me say that. The whole thing probably lasted only a few minutes. The trucks arriving, the transfer, one leaving, the men entering the pub, then later our confrontation. But those few minutes stayed with us because the situation never resolved. There was no final reveal. No one unzipped the bag. No innocent object fell out. No police arrived. No news report confirmed anything. We simply saw something that looked wrong and were denied an explanation. Sometimes that is all it takes. Even now, the part I remember most strongly is not actually the angry man. It is the silent exchange between my brother and me before either of us spoke. Both of us standing outside with cigarettes, watching two men pull that huge black shape from the back of a truck, watching it sag between them, watching them carry it to the waiting vehicle, then looking at each other with exactly the same expression. Neither of us had to say the word. We both knew what it looked like. And maybe that is all it ever was. Something that looked like a body. I genuinely hope so. Because after all this time, the most reassuring explanation is also the boring one. Two men were moving ordinary cargo. Two slightly drunk brothers misread its shape in the dark, and one irritated stranger did not feel like explaining himself. That is probably what happened. But whenever I remember that second truck, waiting with the driver still inside, the bag being thrown in, and the vehicle pulling away almost immediately, there is still a small part of me that wishes the man had simply laughed and told us what was inside. Instead, he called us crazy, slammed down his beer, and left. And because of that, my brother and I still have nothing but the same image we had under that floodlight. A black bag, long enough to hold a person, heavy enough for two men, and no answer to what, exactly, they carried across that parking lot.
Tonight's stories are over. But darkness has a way of making memories feel closer. Some people never forgot what they saw. Others never learned what was behind the sound, the voice, or the shape waiting just outside the light. Tell me in the comments which story you will be thinking about after this ends. Subscribe to Wickless Night for more true accounts from the hours when no one wants to be awake alone. Sleep carefully, and do not trust every shadow that stays still.